through by every student of secular learning. Nimai Pandit did not admit into his grammar class anyone who had not performed his daily worship of Vishnu and had not painted his forehead with the mark of the upward tilaka. Should this be regarded as intolerant? It is no doubt a proposal to ban all education not based on the true religion professed by a Brahmana. Nimai Pandit did not say that non-Brahmanas were to be banished or suppressed forcibly. Atheism has always flourished in this world and is the creed more or less of the vast majority, nay strictly speaking, of almost all persons of this world. It is the paramount duty of every God-fearing man to try his best to help in reducing this appalling volume of atheism. Secular education happens to be such by reason of its total dissociation from religion. It is the outcome of the open atheistic attitude. The pseudo-Vaishnavas are masked atheists and are also advocates and apologists of spurious liberalism, compromise and willing toleration of all forms of unspiritual conduct. The highest devotees are tolerant for a different reason. To the devotee the truth is the only object of worship and he does not recognize any value of any method separated from the object. According to current empiric ethics the method and the object must be severally moral. In other words, the method of the empiric thinker is not identical with the object. Grave harm is apprehended by empiricists if this vital and salutary difference between method and object, insisted upon by empiric morality, is ignored. This is one of the elementary principles of empiric ethics and need not be labored. This separation between method and object does not exist in spiritual conduct. For example, toleration is considered by empiric ethics as a good principle by itself. At any rate, they expect that every consideration should be given to it in coming to any decision in regard to really ethical conduct. If it is necessary to be intolerant under any circumstances, and such contingence is by no means impossible nor rare in practice, the necessity itself is regarded by empiric ethics as an evil which is unavoidable in the present imperfect conditions of this world. Empiric morality is thus perpetually reduced to the form of unprincipled compromise between the principles of hypocritical good and necessary evil, which is regarded as undesirable in theory but unavoidable in practice. Nay, it even recommends as our duty to adopt any compromise, however objectionable, which may be necessitated by an impartial consideration of the specific circumstances of each case. But as there is no such necessity for compromise on the spiritual plane, the difficulty does not exist and the method there is always identical with the object. The apparent intolerance displayed by Sri Gaur Sundar towards novices on the spiritual path is not a necessary evil, a departure under pressure of circumstances from the standard of the absolute good, but the perfect good itself. It is necessary to consider this vital point a little more in detail. Why is empiric ethics under the necessity of viewing the method of an activity as separate from its object? Because it is not possible, circumstanced as we are at present, to understand the whole purpose of any person. A practical code of conduct, the formulation of which is the object of empiric ethics, therefore seeks to correct our unavoidably imperfect knowledge of the whole purpose of another by providing a confessedly imperfect safeguard by attaching a presumptive value to the external features of an act, attempting to join method and object in a separable combination to obtain a rule of conduct which at best possesses only a negative value. In the case of the absolute truth, the obstructive circumstances are altogether absent. Absolute knowledge is perfect knowledge. Conduct issuing from such knowledge has no separable external features that belong even to the so-called ethical conduct of this world. The conduct proceeding from perfect knowledge possesses the perfection of its source. This is not all. This perfection is unattainable on the material plane, whereas it is natural and inevitable on the spiritual plane. On the spiritual plane, the object and method of conduct are alike spiritual. The objects, with which we have to deal on the spiritual plane, are themselves spiritual, that is to say, capable of communicating the knowledge of their real nature to us. This establishes that perfect unity between method and object which is denoted by the term identity, if we want to express it by the nearest material analogy. It is only if we bear in mind this categorical difference between ethical and spiritual conduct that we would be enabled to avoid the blunder of judging spiritual conduct by the empiric ethical standard. And it should also be possible for us to understand the perfect validity of the contention that conduct that is sanctioned by the spiritual test is the only truly ethical conduct, even as regards also its external appearance. In consequence of this rational conviction, such pseudo-ethical fetishes as the so-called principles of toleration, chastity, truthfulness, etc., etc., professed to be worshipped by empiric ethics, cease to impress or frighten and can even be discarded without any chance of being overtaken by those dire immoral consequences which they are utterly unable to prevent or modify. The question of the spiritual value of any external symbol has been confidently decided by empiric thought against the claimant of such value on grounds which that science is equally at a loss to explain. This point has already been treated in another part of the present narrative. It will suffice to say here that the regulation of the connection between the material world and the spiritual, if it is to be at all properly performed, must be placed wholly under the jurisdiction of the latter. That the human body is the temple of the Lord may appear to be no more than a symbol to the empiricist who really understands by symbol as indicating what is not wholly non-existent. But if the empiricist really cares for his own logic, he should call the wholly abstract as also the symbol of the non-existent and vice versa. The spiritual is neither concrete nor abstract mundanity. It is quite different from the concrete and abstract of our mental speculation, both of which are perverted deluding reflections of the substantive truth. The abstract, which the empiricist is pleased to call spiritual for reasons which he cannot explain, is really only the abstract of the relative and is situated at the furthest distance from the absolute reality. The spiritual is neither the concrete gross matter nor the abstract speculation about gross matter. This world, although it seems to have an existence of its own, has really no independent substantive existence. The impersonal or abstract worship, which the empiricist is so anxious to provide, is a figment of his perverted imagination and has no substantive existence even at its source. He is himself only a pseudo-symbolist, and his condemnation of improper symbolization applies really to himself. It is for the deliverance of such blundering pseudo-symbolists from the clutches of this fatal form of delusion that the process of worship enjoined by the Shastras have been laid down by those who are themselves free from such delusion. The Tilaka mark is no doubt a symbol, but it is a symbol of the reality to whom we have no access at present except by means of the real symbol. This symbol is intended, and authorized, to arouse the consciousness of the reality in those who are at present devoid of the same. Those who oppose the symbol on the ground that it does not correspond, like their own unreal symbols, to the perverted, deluding shadow of the truth, are only worshippers of the changing symbol of untruth. The pseudo-symbolists have, indeed, no objection to decorate their gross physical bodies with all manner of symbols of this material world, conceived by them as being the only reality, an assumption which effectively prevents all realization of the very existence of the spiritual symbol. It is rational to try to demolish this suicidal idolatry by substituting in the place of the worship of the symbols of this world the real symbol of the most fundamental fact of the world of the soul, viz., that Godhead in his true form does not indwell the physical body or the materialized mind, but has his eternal abode in the pure consciousness of the immaculate soul who, in his natural position, is free from all connection with matter and who is our only real self. Forgetfulness of our true self is perpetuated by any arrangement that is based upon confusion of the physical body and the materialized mind with the soul or self proper. The decorations naturally coveted by the physical body at the instance of the renegade mind entangles the soul in the meshes of worldly wants. The only decoration of the temple of Godhead is Godhead himself. But neither his temple nor Godhead himself, who dwells therein, are symbols of shadows as the empiricists want us to believe, but the reality himself who possesses the qualities of self-conscious, personal and eternal existence, which is his perfectly consistent logical connotation. Candidates for the knowledge of the truth must be required to prove their bona fide before they are admitted into the Academy of the Truth. This is also imitated by the empiricists in admitting students to institutions of empiric knowledge. Secular learning, sedulously divorced from spiritual living, is responsible for all the miseries of this world. He is a bad physician who hopes to cure his patient by allowing the disease to be aggravated by deliberate and persistent maltreatment. It is the duty of the wise physician to act on the less enterprising maxim that the readiness to prevent is always better than effecting a cure. The uncompromising intolerance of maltreatment fully represents the principle of toleration by its regard for the absolute truth. Real toleration may be defined as extreme partiality for the truth. Toleration and partiality are equally good when they are exercised on behalf of the truth, and are utterly condemnable and terribly mischievous when they are made to serve untruth. The Lord evinced a very particular pleasure in tearing to pieces and exposing mercilessly the pedantic defect of everybody. One of his favorite pastimes consisted in caricaturing the language of the people of Sylhet and East Bengal. The infuriated Sylhetis retorted to the jokes of the renegade son of a Sylhetis by emphatically reminding the irascible tormentor of his own lineage, telling him that he himself, both his parents, in fact every one of his family, belonged to Sylhet. What sense could there be, they demanded with a natural indignation, on the part of such a person to get up a hypocritical condemnation of what also equally concerned himself. But the Lord was not to be denied his pastimes by any manner of argument to the contrary, and his jocular propensity only increased by every effort to convince him of its mischievous and self-condemnatory nature. The Lord, indeed, carried the joke to most unseemly lengths, till at last the angry Sylhetis, losing all patience, grasped at the skirts of the cloth worn by the Lord and dragged him many a day to the king's court to have him punished by the law. The friends of the Lord could extricate him from the clutches of the law on such occasions only by the greatest exertions. The Lord was equally unreasonable towards East Bengal people. He would lie in wait for an opportunity and take to his heels after breaking the Bengalis' begging bowl of dried gourd. The Lord, even while he was following the responsible occupation of teacher, displayed an irrepressible disposition for every kind of prank, with one and only one remarkable exception. He kept strictly aloof from all association with or talk about women. The Lord never looked at women, even by a side glance. Whence, says Thakur Brindavandas, all eminent persons avoid praising Lord Gauranga by describing him as amorous lover. Because although every kind of praise is applicable to the Lord, yet the wise sing only what is appropriate in regard to the distinctive nature of the subject of their praise. Against this clear warning, conveyed by Sri Brindavandas Thakur, who is the only authority universally recognized by the followers of Sri Caitanya in regard to the activities of the Lord during the period of his householder life, there has nevertheless sprung up a definite school which calls itself the community of the Gaurnagaris, i.e., Sweethearts of Gaur, on the ostensible ground that Gaur Sundar is identical with Sri Krishna, and, therefore, the inner meaning of his activities, according to this school, must also be the same as the obvious meaning of the Leela of Sri Krishna. Such a view is opposed to the facts of the narrative described in this work, as also to the specific and explicit testimony of Thakur Brindavandas regarding the practice of the most eminent devotees. The doctrine, therefore, seems to be a concoction of the brains of persons who allow their sensuous imaginations to carry them off their legs even in a matter which lies wholly beyond the reach of our material senses. To such temperaments the activities of Sri Gaur Sundar, both as householder and sannyasin, must ever remain utterly unintelligible. The only course that is open to them for getting rid of their error is to practice unconditional submission at the feet of the transcendental seers and to cherish absolute faith in the truth of their words. Our ribald imagination has no place in the spiritual sphere. The ordinary rules of empiric history strictly subordinate the function of imagination to reasoning based on dependable evidence. In forming the true idea of the personality of Sri Caitanya, it will serve no useful purpose to ignore alike the method of empiric as well as that of spiritual history. The latter requires the imagination to be subordinated to scriptural evidence recorded by the Acharyas. The Gaurnagaris are opposed to the Acharyas. They are also opposed to the ordinary method of empiric history. For these reasons they deserve no hearing either from historians or from those persons who follow the true method laid down in the Shastras. They may be appreciated only by those who want to turn sacred subjects into a means of their own sensuous gratification. It should be enough to remark in this connection that as a householder Sri Gaur Sundar exhibited the leela of leading the life of the ideal devotee, following the path of spiritual endeavor according to the rules laid down in the Shastras and in accordance of their meaning as expounded by the Acharyas. In the latter half of his career the Lord put before us the model of the life led by a devotee who has attained the condition of amorous devotion to the Absolute. In both cases his example makes it necessary for us to give a wide berth to association with females as females in the direct or indirect manner. If it be asked how one is required to conduct himself towards females, the answer that is furnished by the life of Sri Gaur Sundar is that carnality in thought and deed is to be wholly avoided. We have already had an occasion to discuss this very point in connection with the marriage of Sri Lakshmi Devi with the Lord and in describing the relationship that existed between her and Sri Gaur Sundar after the wedding. We must guard ourselves against the error of begging the question by assuming as an axiomatic truth the opinion that the race requires to be presented and propagated by cautious and systematic exercise of the sexual power. But this in itself need not be considered as necessary or even as harmless when it is looked at from the absolute point of view. The race may cease to exist in spite of all our endeavor to preserve it. Where is the guarantee that the human race will endure forever? If one protests against such discussion on the ground that it is profitless for men, such a person may be asked whether he is sure that he is eternally mortal. In discussing the absolute truth, it is necessary to avoid dogmatism prompted by the conditions under which we happen to live at present. Whenever any limit is set to any discussion by means of empiric dogmatism, it ceases to be applicable to the absolute. Therefore, it is necessary not to presuppose the conclusion in a discussion of the absolute. The race may lose the reproductive power, or the earth itself may be destroyed by a cosmic disturbance. The absolute truth should stand in all circumstances. Sri Gaur Sundar shows the method by which the absolute truth can be attained. We may attain to him if we patiently listen to the story of his life from the lips of those who themselves realize his true meaning, viz., from the Icarus. There is no other way. The Gaur-Nagaris follow their own unbridled imaginations and pretend to attain to the absolute truth by an intensive admiration for the mundane sexual activity and sexual thought. Such practice is wholly condemned by the Icarus. The Icarus refuse to accept the argument that the preservation of the human race is the object of human life. They are thus in a position to consider the value of perfect abstention from carnality without prejudice. Birth, reproduction and death are the natural condition of all living things in this world. All other worldly functions are derivatives from these. The question before us is whether it is our duty to perform these functions in the way that may appear to us to be most effective. This, as I have already pointed out, is really begging the question. We should rather ask, if we really want a solution of the problem, why are we reduced to the necessity of undergoing birth, life and death at all? Once this point has been cleared up, we should be able to understand what we have to do. The Shastras say that we are not subject to birth nor death, but possess eternal life. It is not necessary for us to try to prolong a state of existence which is not our real life. On the contrary, our duty is to get rid of ignorance and to attain to our true life, which according to the Shastras is perfectly free from all ignorance and unwholesomeness. The eternal life is both real and attainable. It is not a figment of the deluding imagination. We should try to attain this eternal and perfect life by all means. It is also our duty to use our present perishable life for the attainment of the eternal life. The practice of mundane sexual act and sexual thought is the greatest obstacle in the way of our realization of the absolute truth. This is the teaching of Sri Caitanya exemplified by his own life. The subject will be positively considered in connection with the nature of spiritualism in a subsequent chapter of this work. Sexual act and sexual association in every form are definitely condemned. This fact should not be whittled down by explaining the word stri as meaning all forms of worldly enjoyment or worldliness as a whole. The context does not support this otherwise plausible explanation. Sexuality has been specifically condemned. The question whether perfect freedom from carnality is possible in the married state is beside the point. The sexual inclination may also be present without actually practicing the physical act. If the inclination itself is merely destroyed, it is tantamount to self-destruction. The real spiritual principle, corresponding to carnality, is not condemned. The present unwholesome perversion of outlook is sought to be remedied. Sex in the worldly sense is not valued, but at the same time the existence of the principle in the spirit is admitted. What is asserted is that there should be no confusion between sex in the material sense and the corresponding spiritual principle. The one stands in the way of the realization of the other. The complete elimination of mundane sexual act and thought is not the cause but the inevitable result of the attainment of the spiritual sex. The two can never coexist. In the spiritual, the whole outlook is radically changed. It is not, therefore, possible to understand the nature of the married state of a Vaishnava without taking into account the whole position. It should be enough for our present purpose to state that the Vaishnava loves his wife or husband not as husband or wife but as the spiritual associate of his soul, which precludes the idea of the mundane sex. It is not platonic love, which is a figment of the imagination and has no substantive existence except by reference to mundane sex. The love that joins together pure jiva souls is not and cannot be carnality. Spiritual amor, in the case of the highest souls, is capable of being reciprocated only by Krishna Chandra himself. The love that forms the bond of union between only the highest souls is of the nature of affection that is experienced towards one another by the friendly confidence of the gracious mistress of the one amorous hero. It is the mistress's delight which is absolutely and naturally preferred to one's own, and for the promotion of which one's own spiritual inclination for amorous association with Krishna is wholly discarded, not in the spirit of sacrifice but in the spirit of positive and real exercise of the highest natural instinct. All this falls flat on those who retain any trace of the taste for mundane sexuality. The purpose of the institution of marriage is fulfilled by the complete elimination of sexuality following on the associated pursuit of this spiritual end by the married couple. They must have no ideal of carnal connection as husband and wife. When this state has been realized, the marriage tie ceases automatically to have any sexual import. The Vaishnava has no husband or wife except Sri Sri Radha Krishna. This is the necessary disappearance of the apparent on the appearance of the true self, and the complete fulfillment of the spiritual instinct reflected in a perverted form in the principle of sex. The doubt regarding the questionable kind of society that will result from the carrying out of the idea troubles us only so long as we continue to confound the soul with the physical body. The soul is neither born nor does he die. When the soul realizes his own nature, his prospects are at once and radically changed. He begins to function on a different plane. The selfish and unwholesome ambition that necessitated his incarceration in the house of correction of this world naturally disappears on the attainment of other and purer ambitions and a larger vision. Those things which appear to be vital in this world, e.g., the preservation of the species by the exertion of the reproductive power, etc., etc., are rendered unnecessary in the realm of the spirit, which is the real home of the eternal souls that are unborn and imperishable. The Lord continued to teach his pupils in the Chandi Mandap of Mukunda Sanya. He sat there in the midst of his pupils expounding the Shastras, while medicinal oil, named after Vishnu, was applied to his head by some favored person, to afford relief to the nervous malady which it was his pastime to manifest. He explained the texts in endless ways. The Lord taught his pupils from early morning till midday, when he repaired to the Ganges to bathe. He was engaged till midnight every day in teaching and helping his students to prepare their lessons. All those who studied at the feet of the Lord became pandits in course of the year by attaining the knowledge of the principles of the Shastras. This was the daily life of Sri Chaitanya Deva as professor. The Lord relished nothing except the sweet taste of learning. The view that Sri Chaitanya was never in a perfectly sound state of mind has been put forward by a few persons out of sheer malice and ignorance. The motive of such unfortunate people is to find, or even invent, a reason for proving their ignorance. If the brain of an insane person be capable of supplying the clue to the knowledge of the reality to the sane ignorant persons of this world, the latter need not neglect to be benefited thereby. Worldly people are never considered to be out of their proper senses by the allopaths, homeopaths, hakams and Vaidyas of this world, who pride themselves on the infallibility of their power of diagnosing all kinds of mental and physical ailments. But if all worldly people are proved to be irrational and deluded, should the medical sciences condescend to take serious notice of such aberration? Disease is one of the ordinary devices of the deluding power of Sri Chaitanya, intended by his mercy to shake the confidence of worldly people in the certainty and value of the pleasures derivable from the hallucinative workings of the medically sound mind and body. A medically sound mind in a medically sound body is the summum bonum of the medical sciences. Is it altogether impossible for a sound mind in a sound body, which can pass the medical test, to be really utterly unsound? What else can be the cause of the impermanence of this particular form of the summum bonum in the wise providence of the All-Merciful? The deluding power tries to cure the spiritual malady of the conditioned souls by the device of the bodily and mental diseases, which demonstrate conclusively the worthlessness and trivial nature of the ideal that promises to secure for the possessor of a sound mind in a sound body an abundance of the so-called sensuous happiness obtainable in this world. But the lesson is lost on pedantic medical men whose horizon is straitly squeezed between the earth and sky of the body and mind, utterly engrossed in the reckless pursuit of worldly enjoyment. But disease can for this reason neither terrify nor delude the pure soul of the Vaishnava. The nature of the malady of Sri Chaitanya, if rightly diagnosed on the lines indicated, has also the power of curing both the physicians and their patients of the spiritual disease of organized hypocrisy and self-deception willfully nursed by all worldly people, which prevent them from knowing the truth by subjecting them to the mental delusions of the flesh. The Lord's marriage with Sri Vishnupriya Devi took place about this time. A detailed account of the event has been recorded by Thakur Sri Brindavandas. Before we enter upon those details, it is necessary to dispose of certain considerations that may naturally arise in our minds in connection with this particular event. The marriage of the Lord for a second time seems to require an imperative explanation. Strict monogamy on the part of both husband and wife is the highest ideal of marriage, as embodied in the narrative of Sri Ramachandra and Sita Devi. Conjugal love in the worldly sense also seems to be best guaranteed by such ideal, which makes it the right reserved of two particular persons to be the mutual recipients of connubial love. This alone, it is supposed, can make conjugal love both perfect and pure. According to this test, Nimai Pandit, if he is to be regarded as an ideal husband of his first consort, should have abstained from marrying a second time. He cannot be supposed to have been subject in an abnormal degree to this particular frailty of the flesh, and should have been able to remain constant to his first married love even after her departure from this world. But the nature as well as the object of the Lord's marriage are altogether different from those made on this earth. The Lord's marriage is the only real marriage. The marriages that take place among the people of this world is an unwholesome caricature of the reality. The proper way of putting the question mooted above would, therefore, be not that the marriage of the Lord should conform to the human ideal, but that the human ideal itself may be lived down by the realization of the substantive truth, viz., the marriage of the Lord, of which it happens to be the distorted, unwholesome reflection. With the attainment of the substantive truth, the automatic subsidence of the malady of the sensual appetite, the basis of the human institution of marriage, needs must be inevitable. The Lord's marriage, which is eternally enacted on the spiritual plane, made its appearance apparently under the conditions of limited time and space in order to effect the cure of the disease of sexuality to which the perverse soul is found to be addicted. Amorous love between male and female, which is cherished as one of the rarest privileges of man and as the source of his highest, purest and most exquisite happiness available on this earth, is not really a blessing at all, but on the contrary may become by its abuse the greatest of all the curses that afflict those who choose to be the temporary denizens of this world. But it is by no means possible to get rid of the distemper, even if we could be convinced that it is such a possible evil. The Shastras have recommended marriage in place of promiscuous and unrestrained sexual relationship in order to provide a salutary check on sexual indulgence in the only practicable form. This is intelligible, but it is not perfectly clear, while they also direct that the sexual act, which must be practiced with restraint, should also be performed for pleasing Vishnu, and not for the gratification of the sensuous appetite itself. The Shastras declare that by pleasing Vishnu, parents as well as their issue will be really benefited by obtaining lasting immunity from the clutches of mundane lust. But it is very difficult to understand what the Shastras really mean when they enjoin the performance of the sexual act of generation to please Vishnu. Are we to suppose that the sexual act is pure in itself and as such is a fit offering for the Lord? That it is, therefore, our duty to indulge in sexual activity desired by God Himself? This does not, however, appear to be the proper meaning of the Shastric injunctions regarding Sattvika marriage. The object of the Shastras is to discourage sensuality in any form. The sexual act minus sensuality is a contradiction in terms. The Shastras do not plainly tell us so, but they nevertheless clearly leave it to be inferred that the institution of marriage is for the purpose of getting rid of sensuality. Why is Vishnu dragged into this sensuous affair at all? But how else also is sensuousness to be overcome, if it is desirable to get rid of it? By the touch of the Lord alone the hold of the flesh on our soul slackens automatically. If one marries really for pleasing Vishnu, the Lord accepts the offering that is sincerely made. The acceptance of the Lord helps the realization of the object of the offering. But when such an offering is made, the person making it should do so in the right spirit. He is instructed as to the right spirit by the Shastras. If his prayer is offered really to please the Lord, or, in other words, for the purpose enjoined by the Shastras which tell us how the Lord is pleased, the Lord fulfills such prayer by granting its object. The devotee experiences the effect of his conduct in the simultaneous increase of his peace of conscience, the increasing realization of the spiritual existence centered in the lotus feet of Vishnu, and subsidence of sensuous hankering for the things of this world. It is as if fire had burnt up all impurities by its introduction into the scavenger's heap. Strength and health of body are coveted, among other things, for the purpose that they are necessary for the procreation of strong and healthy children. But is not this a begging of the question to be proved? If I have myself no use for strength of body and mind except its blind, mechanical exercise, my condition will be altogether chaotic. Order, especially moral order, is impossible without conscious subordination to one supreme purpose. There must be some intelligible object to which all our faculties may be unhesitatingly directed. That object is the attainment of the lotus feet of Vishnu, where dwells eternally all highest activity, knowledge and bliss. Strength and health of body are by their nature perishable. We do not really know why they come to us and why they leave us, so we should not be unduly attached to them for their sake. If God permits us to possess them for a time, we should use them solely for attaining the abiding shelter of the holy feet of the Lord. There is, no doubt, marriage in the realm of the absolute. That is the true marriage. That marriage is eternal. There the Lord is the only lover and husband, and all souls are the recipients of his perfect love. This is possible only in the Lord and in the spiritual world. If any mortal attempts to have many wives or mistresses in this world, he is warned by the Shastras against the utter folly and wickedness of such conduct. The self-same Shastras declare that the Lord is the only enjoyer of every creature, and that marriage with the Lord is the summum bonum of the spiritual condition. There is, of course, no room for any mental or physical activity in such relationship. It is the exercise of the eternal relationship of the pure souls in their spiritual non-material state with the all-soul. Conditioned souls, who happen to be under the lure of the flesh, cannot think of marriage except by reference to mundane sex. But the Shastras enjoin marriage as a help in realizing the life eternal by spiritual cooperation between husband and wife, for living down the mundane sensual instinct. They instruct us to succeed in this by cultivating the effective spiritual desire of pleasing the Lord by our every act. As the Lord can be served under all circumstances and in every externally mundane act, why should the sexual act be an exception to the rule? It should be possible to serve the Lord by the sexual act as by any other form of apparent worldly activity. But the sexual act that is performed as service of the Lord cannot, for that very reason, belong to this mundane plane. It becomes spiritual activity which is absolutely free from all sensuous and unwholesomeness. It is better than any negative process. Sri Caitanya enacted the Leela of abstaining from all ordained sexual activity during the period of his married life. On this point Sri Caitanya differs wholly from Sri Krsna, who apparently begot numberless children and also cultivated unconventional amorous relationships with the milkmaids who were not his wedded wives. In essence, there is of course no difference between the two. On the spiritual plane, abstinence and enjoyment are alike wholesome and are really opposed to one another. The conduct of Sri Caitanya need not therefore be regarded as moral or wholesome in the worldly sense, or as either more or less pure than that of Sri Krishna or than that of his own married followers. On the spiritual plane there is no unwholesomeness or objectionable factor. There is only an infinite range of the most varied excellences and exquisiteness. The conduct of Sri Caitanya as married householder is far above the level of that of every other householder as setting, in a way that is capable of being grasped by the conditioned soul, the spiritual ideal for his special benefit, and safeguard him from radical misconceptions regarding the nature of the union of Sri Radhika with Sri Krishna, the only perfect and substantive marriage. Sri Krishna has really only one sweetheart, viz. Sri Radhika, as Sri Radhika herself has no other tie except her love for Krishna. The realization of Sri Krishna by Sri Radhika is the only absolute realization of the absolute. All other realizations are secondary and derivative but true, and are attainable only by the grace of Sri Radhika. The secondary realizations are, however, both possible and perfect so long as they happen to subserve the supreme purpose of Sri Radhika. The devotees of Sri Caitanya attain this dependent perfection of service by following loyally his teaching as well as example. Dissociated from either, all souls descend automatically into the sphere of sensuous imperfection. But the source of all perfect service is Sri Radhika, who is the counter-whole of Sri Krishna. Sri Caitanya personates the function of Sri Radhika towards her eternal consort, in order to bestow the loving service of Sri Radhika to conditioned souls who have no taste at all for the spiritual service of the Lord. He is the ideal devotee, devoted to his Lord. Such devotee admits no relationship with anything except the Lord. So long as Sri Caitanya continued to exhibit the Leela of leading the life of a married householder, he showed clearly that it is possible to marry in order to serve the Lord, which is incompatible with the least attachment or love for anybody else except Godhead. He was a dutiful son, brother, husband, friend, without being attached in the least to brother, husband, friend or father in the worldly sense. Krishna was all along his sole father, mother, brother, wife, friend. The devotees were no doubt loved by Sri Chaitanya, as they served Krishna in the same way that he himself did. He refused to be led by any of his devotees and compelled all who desired his favor to serve only Krishna. This quality of absolute independence and aggressive superiority of his service of Krishna raises him above all his associates and followers. But this superiority must not be imitated by any other person. All other persons should serve Sri Krishna in obedience to Sri Chaitanya. That is to say, by submission to Sri Radhika, who is Krishna himself and who cannot be disobeyed by his devotees. This premier position of Sri Radhika and its rationale has been made intelligible to souls under the thraldom of Maya by the career of Sri Chaitanya. The Jiva soul should stand to Sri Radhika in the same relation as his followers stand to Sri Chaitanya himself. Sri Krishna is served independently by Sri Radhika alone, who employs an infinite army of her own servants, i.e., either inseparable or separable portions of her essence in her service of Krishna. Before beginning his account of the marriage of Sri Gaurasundar and Vishnupriya Devi, Thakur Brindavandas takes particular care to mention that the Supreme Lord, Sri Chaitanya, never even listened to the name of a female. This precautionary remark is followed up by the observation that Sri Gauranga must on no account be prayed to as the amorous lover, notwithstanding his identity with Sri Krishna. This salutary and most important and explicit prohibition has been too often deliberately ignored by the Gaurnagaris by deviating deliberately or through ignorance from the path enjoined by Sri Chaitanya himself and his most authentic biographer and associates. This sect, arguing from the fact of identity between Sri Chaitanya and Sri Krishna, persists in regarding Sri Chaitanya as taking delight in amorous dalliances with his consorts and sweethearts at Nabadwip. Under the lead of a corrupt duty, these misguided people have not even scrupled to invent imaginary stories of Sri Chaitanya's amorous escapades in order to bring his activities into line with those of Sri Krishna. This is an unpardonable and immoral travesty of authentic history and an offense at the holy feet of Sri Chaitanya and his associates. In fact, there cannot be a greater blunder, nor one that is more disastrous in its spiritual and moral consequences, than this open attempt to ignore that very feature of the career of Sri Chaitanya which constitutes the most characteristic distinction between his Leela and that of Sri Krishna. The activities of Sri Chaitanya are absolutely free from even the appearance of mundane sexuality. Let us follow in the footsteps of Thakur Brindavandas in describing the marriage of the Lord for a second time, and being armed with this basic principle of his career, try to understand a little more definitely the real significance of the marriage of Sri Gauranga with Sri Vishnupriya Devi as we proceed with the narrative itself. The narrative is presented by Thakur Brindavandas in the following manner. The Supreme Lord was wholly absorbed with tasting the sweets of learning and teaching his students after the departure of Sri Lakshmi Devi from this world. But Sachi Devi had no other thought than that of finding a suitable maiden to marry her son a second time. She at last arrived at a satisfactory decision. She had noticed with approbation the conduct of a young maiden, Vishnupriya, the daughter of a well-known father, Rapandit Sanatan Misra. Sachi Devi had frequently met this girl at the bathing ghat of the Ganges. Sanatan Misra was a native of Nabadwip. He was of a most merciful disposition. He was possessed of a frank and generous nature and the highest faith in Vishnu. His occupation consisted in doing good to others and showing hospitality to all chance guests. He was truthful, self-controlled, born of a high family. He was well-to-do and had a large number of dependents. Sri Vishnupriya Devi, mother of the world, was the very self of Lakshmi Devi, the eternal consort of Sri Narayana. Sachi Devi had conceived a great affection for the maiden at the very first sight and regarded her as worthy of being the consort of her son. Vishnupriya was accustomed from infancy to bathe in the Ganges twice and even thrice every day and had no other interest in her life save devotion to her father, mother and Vishnu. She daily met Sachi Devi at the bathing ghat of the Ganges and greeted her feet with great humility. The mother also blessed her with the greatest affection. May Krishna bestow on you the favor of a worthy husband. During her baths in the Ganges, Sri Sachi Devi conceived the desire of joining the girl to her son in the bond of nuptial union. As a matter of fact, the very idea had also already occurred to the Rapandit and his family, and Sanatan Misra was no less anxious to bestow his daughter or Sri Gaurasundar. It so chanced that one day Sachi Devi, having sent for Kasanath Pandit, requested him to make the formal proposal of the marriage of his daughter with her son to the Rapandit and also to arrange the same in a definite manner if he was agreeable. Kasanath Pandit immediately made his way to the Rapandit and after being received with great respect, submitted his proposal. It was to this effect: I have a proposal to make to you. I would ask you by all means to do what I am going to propose if you consider it desirable. Give your daughter to Viswambhar Pandit. I consider the connection altogether suitable. He is the proper husband for your daughter, as this best of maidens is also in every way fit bride for him. They suit one another exactly as Krsna and Rukmini. On this the Ra Pandit held a hurried consultation with the members of his family, who also pressed upon him the desirability of unhesitating and immediate acceptance of the proposal. Thereupon the Ra Pandit informed Kasanath Pandit that he had no objection to bestow his daughter on Viswambhar Pandit. If such a connection could be settled for his daughter, he would regard it as nothing less than the reward of the previous good deeds of himself and his whole family. He informed Kasanath Pandit to return to Sachi Devi and inform her of his decision. He repeated his assurance that he was prepared to carry out his word by all means. On hearing this, Kasanath Pandit with great satisfaction took his leave and laid his information of what had happened before Sachi Devi. The mother was delighted on hearing the success of her endeavor and busily set about making the necessary preparations for the marriage of her son. On learning of the approaching nuptials of the Lord, all his disciples felt the utmost gladness in their hearts. The great Buddhimanta was the first to offer his services in this connection. He said that he would bear all the expenses of the marriage. Mukunda Sanya protested, as it would completely shut himself out. Buddhimanta Khan replied that the marriage would not be celebrated on the paltry scale of the wedding of a Brahmana, but on that of a prince. The Adhiba ceremony, preliminary to wedding, was celebrated with great clat by all friends and followers at the auspicious moment on the auspicious day. Huge canopies were hung up and the grounds were enclosed by rows of plantain trees on all sides. Pitchers filled with water, lighted lamps, paddy grain, milk curd, twigs of the mango and every other kind of auspicatory articles were collected on the spot in huge quantities, and the whole ground was beautifully painted with the solution of powdered rice, lipana. All Vaishnavas, Brahmanas and other worthy persons of Nabadwip were invited to partake. In the afternoon, the betel nut of the Adhiba ceremony. Musicians duly turned up as soon as it was afternoon and struck up a delightful concert. The music was swelled by the sounds of mridanga, sanai, jidak kartal and other instruments. The bards began to recite the praises of the family and loyal matrons uttered glorificatory ejaculations. The Brahmanas raised the Vedic chant as the jewel of the best community of the twice-born made his appearance and assumed his seat in the center of the assembled people. The Brahmanas, who had congregated, thereupon experienced a great joy in their minds as they sat in a circle round Sri Gaur Sundar. Then they brought out the perfumes, sandal paste, betel, excellent garlands and distributed among the Brahmanas. They placed the garland round the head, smeared all parts of the body with the sandal paste and offered a pot full of betels to every single guest. Nadia was but the community of the Brahmanas. There was no end of Brahmanas at Nadia. It was not possible to ascertain the number of the Brahmanas as they continued to arrive and depart. Among them there were also not a few who were extremely greedy and who, after receiving their presents once, returned in a different dress. Presenting themselves in the thick of the crowd, these greedy Brahmanas carried away repeatedly sandal, betel nut and garlands. All were mad with joy. Who could recognize anybody? The Lord laughingly gave the command to give away sandal and garlands 3 times to every one. By this command the Lord condoned the offense of those who, having taken once, persisted to take the articles over and over again. The Lord loves the Brahmanas. He thought in his mind that if a Brahmana was caught in the act of taking more than once, he ran the risk of being chided by some careless person. It is, however, an offense to take anything by cunning in matters spiritual. The Lord, therefore, provided against all these contingencies by ordering all the articles to be given away 3 times to every one. All persons were highly delighted by obtaining them in a triple measure, and no one again took anything by cunning. Garlands, sandal, betel nut and betel that were given away in this manner exceeded all limits. The secret how this was possible no one knew, let alone what men actually received. That portion of it which was dropped on the ground in the act of giving away would have sufficed for 5 ordinary marriages if the quantity could be available in the household of any other person. All persons were exceedingly gladdened in their hearts. All said, all praise to the Sadhibas. We have seen millionaires in this Nabadwip. No one's ancestor ever performed such a grand Adhiba ceremony. No one gave away so ungrudgingly such excellent sandal, garlands, betel nut and betel. Presently the Ra Pandit arrived with a glad heart and with all the requisites for the Adhiba ceremony. He was accompanied by Brahmanas, relations and a great company of merry musicians, singers and dancers. The Ra Pandit joyfully put the Tilaka mark on the forehead of the Lord in accordance with the method enjoined by the Vedas. This joyful event was acclaimed by a great chorus of the chant of Hari and the singing of hymns of praise. All loyal matrons also acclaimed the glorious event. The greatest rejoicings manifested themselves in the form of music and song. Having in this manner performed the Adhiba ceremony, the prince of Brahmanas, Sanatan, returned home. The kinsfolk of the Lord also went forth and performed the Adhiba ceremony of Lakshmi at the latter's home in the same way. Both sides also performed with the greatest zeal every other customary rite. Chapters v. Marriage with Sri Vishnupriya Devi Kant. On the auspicious morn following the Adhiba ceremony, the Lord bathed in the Ganges and performed the worship of Vishnu. Thereafter, in the company of all relations and friends, he applied himself to the due performance of Nandimuk and other rites. There was a great uproar of music, dance and song. Auspicatory shouts of praise were raised on all sides. Innumerable pots filled with water, paddy grain, milk curd, lighted lamps, twigs of the mango, were placed at the doorways, inside the rooms and all about the yard. On all sides flags of diverse colors gaily waved in the breeze. Plantain trees, to which branches of the mango were tied, were planted in every direction. Then the mother was busily occupied in the company of all the matrons with the due performance of all customary rites. Having first of all worshipped the Ganges, the joyful party proceeded to the site of the goddess Shasti to the sound of music. Having worshipped Shasti, the mother and her entourage visited the homes of all friends and went through the customary performance at each household. The party returned home after having accomplished these protracted functions. Sachi Devi made all the ladies heavy presents of fried rice, plantain, oil, betel and vermilion. By the will of the Lord, the articles exceeded all measure, and Sachi Devi gave away to every one in 5 and 7-fold measure. All the ladies literally swam in oil. There was none whose heart's desire was not completely fulfilled. There were similar high rejoicings in Lakshmi's home under the conduct of Lakshmi's mother. In a fit of ecstatic delight, the Ra Pandit flung away all his resources in these festivities. After the due performance of all these ceremonies, Sri Gaur had a respite which he utilized in making presents of eatables and clothing to all the Brahmanas, evincing, in the method, the greatest humility. He accorded the fullest respect to all of them in due proportion of the worth of each. The Brahmanas then returned to their homes for their meals after blessing the Lord with the greatest affection. As the day wore into afternoon, all the people applied themselves to the pleasant function of robbing the Lord. This was an elaborate process. The whole body of the Lord was anointed with sandal paste and other perfumes with well-designed interspaces. On the forehead of the Lord a crescent was painted with sandal, inside which was put the charming Tilaka mark made of perfume. A wonderful crown adorned his beautiful head. His whole frame was covered with garlands. Excellent cloth of the finest grain was worn in the triple-girdled style, trikachha. His beautiful eyes were painted with collyrium. Paddy grain, durba grass and cotton thread were tied to his wrist. Tender shoots of the plantain with the mirror were placed in his hand. A pair of golden pendants hung down from his ears. The upper parts of his arms were bound with dazzling chains of various precious jewels. Whatever decoration was likely to set forth the beauty of each limb was put in the proper part by all the people with the greatest delight. All persons of both sexes were fascinated by the sight of the appearance of the Lord attired as bridegroom, and in their joy had no thoughts on their own account. When the last quarter of the day still lingered, all people gave their opinion that it was time to make the auspicious start so that the Lord might arrive at the house of the bride in the hour of twilight, after perambulating the whole of Nabadwip for the space of 1 full prahara. And now Buddhimanta Khan joyfully brought up an excellent litter, dola, which he had specially made for the occasion. There arose a great tumult of song and music. The Brahmanas recited the auspicatory texts of the Veda. The bards began to recite eulogies. Joy assumed a visible form on all sides. Then, after passing his mother on the right and having bowed with great respect to the Brahmanas as Sri Gauranga seated himself on the dola, there arose all around him the triumphal shouts of benedictions. The ladies uttered haze. There could be heard nothing but auspicious sounds in every direction. The Lord first of all proceeded to the side of the Ganges. There he saw the Hafm just overhead. Thousands of lights now began to burn. There was a great variety of fireworks. The soldiers of Buddhimanta Khan marched in front and were followed by his other employees in double file. Behind them marched the bearers of flags of different colors. Pantomimes and clowns in various guises followed. Dancers in innumerable groups danced along with the utmost gaiety. Jaidak, Birdak, Mridanga, Kahal, Padhaha, Dagar, Conch, flute of reed, karadal, paranga, horn, instruments with 5 different melodies in countless number, made up the vast concert. The Lord laughed as he noted with pleasure millions of children dancing along with great merriment in the midst of the musicians. On beholding that great rejoicing, not children only but all the wise men joined the procession, dancing by discarding all shame. Having arrived on the bank of the Ganges, the party of the bridegroom halted and performed, for a short while, dance, song and hilarious music. This was succeeded by incessant raining of flowers. After making obeisance to the Ganges, the party traversed merrily the whole of Nabadwip. On beholding the equipages of the marriage that are far above anything mortal, all people experienced a great ecstasy in their minds. The people said, "We have seen many big marriages. Never did we see such grandeur." Men and women of fortunate Nadia in this manner floated on the tide of happiness on beholding the Lord. All were happy save only those Brahmanas who had beautiful and married daughters in their homes. Those Brahmanas gave vent to their sorrows. "I could not bestow my daughter on such a groom. I have no luck. Whence could it be otherwise?" Thakur Brindavandas, describing the marriage festivities of the Lord, in the words quoted above, makes his obeisance to the feet of the residents of Nabadwip who possess the power of beholding beatific sights like these. Thus did the Lord merrily journey from one quarter of the town to another of the whole of Nabadwip. He then came to the residence of Rapandit just in the hour of twilight and was received by multitudinous acclamations which mingled with the tumult raised by the musicians of the parties of bride and bridegroom vying with each another. Rapandit, advancing with great respect, took the Lord in his arms from the dola and conveyed him to his seat. The Pundit scattered flowers with his own hands, being perfectly oblivious of his own body by joy on beholding his son-in-law. Then, having brought out all the requisites of the ceremonial election of bridegroom, the Brahmana seated himself to accept the Lord formally as his son-in-law. He duly performed this ceremony of election by the offering of water for washing the feet, the requisites of worship, water to rinse the mouth, clothing and ornaments. Then his spouse appeared with the other ladies and began to perform the auspicatory rites according to the approved form. The ladies placed grains of paddy and blades of the durba grass on the beautiful head of the Lord and waved a lighted lamp of 7 wicks fed by clarified butter in front of the Lord. They continued to ejaculate the glorificatory note as they cast at him fried rice and shell. Thus did they perform the customary rites. And now, having decked her in all her ornaments, they brought up Sri Lakshmi Devi, conveying her on a seat. On this the friends of the Lord merrily lifted him up by his seat. Then, according to the custom, having put up an inner screen round the Lord, the bride was made to perambulate the Lord 7 times by keeping him on her right. After perambulating the Lord 7 times, Lakshmi Devi placed herself in front of him in the attitude of obeisance. Then there was a great throwing of flowers, and the instruments of both parties put up a great music. On all sides male and female continued to employ their voices in acclamation. Joy himself came down from on high in his visible form. Sri Lakshmi Devi, Mother of the World, made the surrender of herself by placing the garland of flowers at the feet of the Lord. Gaur Sundar, with a slight smile, took up the garland and placed it round the neck of Lakshmi. Then Lakshmi and Narayana began to throw flowers at each other with great alacrity. Brahma and other gods, remaining invisible, merrily sent showers of flowers. The partisans of Lakshmi and the Lord now got up a violent quarrel on behalf of the bride and groom, with minds delirious with joy. The followers of Lakshmi and those of the Lord seemed to prevail alternately as the people continued with peals of laughter to inform the Lord. A slight smile played on the beautiful face of the Lord. On beholding this, all people swam in the current of transcendental bliss. Thousands of great torches burnt brightly. Nothing could be heard on account of the tumultuous music. The music and acclamations of the charming rite of catching the first glimpse of each other's moon-like faces pervaded all worlds. So great was that mighty uproar. Having thus gaily performed the ceremony of Sri Mukchandrika, Sri Gaur Sundar took his seat in the company of Sri Lakshmi. Thereafter Rapandit also assumed a seat, with his mind overflowing with delight, for the purpose of making the offering of his daughter. Having duly offered water for washing the feet, the requisites for worship, water for cleansing the mouth, he uttered the formula of his decision to offer his daughter. The pious father of Sri Lakshmi Devi, desiring only the pleasure of Vishnu, made over his daughter into the hands of the Lord. He then gave expression to his pent-up joy by giving away as dowry goodly cows, land, beds, male and female slaves in great abundance. He then caused Sri Lakshmi Devi to be seated on the left side of the Lord and began to perform the ceremony of offering libation to fire. After performing all the scriptural and customary rites, he conducted the bridegroom and bride to the inner apartments. Vaikuntha manifested itself in the house of Ra Pandit. At last the couple sat down to meal. Lakshmi and Krishna remained joyously together during that night unto supreme benediction. Who can express in words the joy that possessed Sanatan Pandit and his whole family? Sanatan and his family now realized the same high fortune as fell of yore to the lot of Nagnajit, Janaka, Vishmaka, Jambubanta, as the fulfillment of his previous devoted service of Vishnu. At break of day, the essence of all the worlds performed the remaining social rites. In the afternoon, as the hour of returning home drew near, there began a great display of music, song and dance. Loud acclamations rent every direction. The ladies shouted haze. The Brahmanas recited blessings and read slokas from the Veda in keeping with the occasion of starting. Dek, Padaha, Sanai, Baranga, Karata 1 played vociferously, vying with one another. The Lord, having bowed to the superiors, ascended the Dola in the company of Lakshmi. All the people raised the triumphant shout of the name of Hari as they formed in procession and led away the jewel of the race of the twice-born. All those persons, who beheld them as they proceeded on their way, praised them most admiringly and in many diverse ways. The ladies obtaining a sight of the pair said, "This girl is most fortunate. She must have served Kamala and Parvati during her many lives." Some of them said, "They seem to be Hera and Gauri themselves." Another lady declared, "Methinks they are Kamala and Sri Hari." There were those who expressed the view that the couple were certainly Rati and Kamadeva. To the minds of others they seemed like Indra and Sachi. Some held that they most resembled Ramachandra and Sita. Thus said all those ladies of excellent deeds. Thakur Brindavandas expressed once more his appreciation of the high fortune of the male and female inhabitants of Nabadwat who had power to witness these glories of the Lord. All people over the whole of Nadia overflowed with happiness by the auspicious glance of Lakshmi and Narayana. The marriage procession moved along with the greatest merriment, with dance, song and music, amid a continuous shower of flowers. Then in an auspicious moment ushered by every blessing, Lakshmi and Narayana merrily arrived at their home. The mother, attended by the loyal matrons, most gladly welcomed the daughter-in-law into the house. As Lakshmi and Narayana entered their apartments and assumed their seats, a mighty acclamation of praise filled the whole universe. Thakur Brindavandas, with due sense of the nature of the occasion, writes that the joy that manifested itself is beyond all expression and that no one can describe that glory. If the eye but once beholds the glow of the person of the Lord, that fortunate person is cleansed of all his sins and repairs to the realm of Vaikuntha. All those people had a direct vision of the marriage of the Lord. The Lord rightly bears the appellations of merciful and Lord of the humble. Then the Lord satisfied all the dancers, bards and beggars, by the gift of clothing, money and kind words. The Lord with his own hands merrily gave away clothing to all the Brahmanas, relatives, friends and to everyone severally. The Lord bestowed his embrace on Buddhimanta Khan, whose joy no words can describe. These Leelas have never any interval. The Veda says of their appearance and disappearance. Who can even in 100 years describe all the Leelas that took place within the space of a single danda? Accepting on my head, says Thakur Brindavandas, the command of Nityananda Swarup, I write the mere summary in pursuance of his mercy. He concludes the account of the divine marriage with the remark that whoever reads or listens to these Leelas of the Supreme Lord, verily enjoys communion with Gauranga himself. We have attempted to give above the account of the marriage of Sri Gaur Sundar and Sri Vishnupriya Devi in the words of Thakur Brindavandas himself, in order that the reader may have, as far as possible, the actual words of the highest authority, the Vyasa, of the Leela of Sri Caitanya. It will be our subordinate duty to try to understand this severely compressed account in the light of the commentators. An attempt on this line has already been made in a previous chapter in discussing the marriage of the Lord with Sri Lakshmi Devi. We shall confine ourselves here to the task of adding a few remarks to what have already been presented to the reader on the same subject at that place. The Lord makes his appearance in this world with his paraphernalia. When the Lord chooses to manifest the Leela of the devotee, he is attended by all his consorts, each in her corresponding appropriate role. Sri Caitanya has two consorts, appearing successively one at a time. Sri Lakshmi Devi is that aspect of the divine power who is termed Sri or beauty by the scriptures. She represents spiritual law, who is eternally in attendance on her Lord. Even when the Lord chooses to appear in this world, he is served by the higher law of the spiritual realm. This does not require to be masked, as it is not liable to be misunderstood even by bound souls. But as the divine manifestation grows towards maturity, the regulated service recedes to the background, making way for spontaneous devotion. This also has to make room for the highest form, viz., service in apparent separation. It is not the purpose at this stage to enter fully into the subject of the nature of the divine power and her various faces. In Krishna Leela there is no use of any restraint by the divinity in his pastimes. The realm and consorts of Godhead appear in that Leela as they are in Chaitanya Leela. They appear in their mellower form of relationship of love for the bound soul. The bound soul is not banished from the pastimes of Krishna because Krishna makes no difference between one soul and another and is always prepared to deal with a person in accordance with the latter's disposition and according as service is rendered or refused. Sri Chaitanya Leela exhibits the indiscriminate mercy of the Lord to bound souls. This means that Krishna Leela in the positive aspect is not altogether closed to the bound soul. The latter may even serve Krishna by his grace even in this world by the process of service of the highest order. The point that is to be specially noticed in this connection is the fact that the bound soul may serve the Lord in exactly the same way as the soul in the state of grace. The Lord with 11 his consorts, associates, realm and paraphernalia is always at the door of the bound soul and ever willing to offer him his very highest service that is rendered to the Lord in the divine realm proper. The very statement of the above proposition suggests a number of most reasonable objections. If the Lord is with the bound soul as much as he is with his eternal devotees, why cannot the former always have the sight of him and his? The reply is that this is so in order to add a special charm to his service and one that is coveted by even the purest souls but which is not available to all of them although it is unsolicitously open to every bound soul. The very condition, viz., the bound state, helps the most charming realization of the eternal function. The bound soul cannot see Krishna and his eternal devotees as they really are. But the bound soul is privileged to realize that Krishna and his eternal devotees are identical with Sri Chaitanya and his associates whom he can see and serve with his available faculties if he is only willing to do so. But the bound soul can also see Lakshmi Devi and Vishnupriya Devi, Mother Sachi and Sri Jagannath Misra, in their real eternal forms. This is so because unless they see at least the pure soul as he really is, they cannot understand the relationship of separation from the Lord to which they are doomed by the bound state. This vision is dependent on the fulfillment of the condition of willing acceptance of its real import. But this inclination is rarely coveted for the very reason that the wish is realized without any difficulty. This is so unbelievable. If one reads this account without complete acceptance of and faith in its conclusions, he will necessarily fail to realize its truth. Hypothetical or tentative acquiescence in certain assumptions, for the purpose of enjoying the charms of an artistic conception based on those assumptions, is not sufficient for a reader of the Chaitanya Bhagavat if one is really anxious to follow the method of self-discipline laid down in the work as the indispensable condition for the proper realization of the substantive truth. This faith in the only cognizable forms of the reality is not natural to the bound state and is apparently opposed to the same. At this point the help and guidance of sadhus or self-realized souls become an absolute necessity. The bound soul is ever tending to fly away after the elusive appearances of the deluding energy. He is convinced that he will find in such pursuit, in the long run, what his perverted nature most ardently desires, viz., boundless sensuous enjoyment for himself. It is, therefore, almost impossible to expect him to destroy these seemingly sole objects of his heart's desire by his own hands. This is the task that the sadhu has got to perform for him for the benefit of the bound soul. The sadhu is seconded in his efforts by the spiritual scriptures but is opposed by everything else in this world. This is not inexplicable. The erring soul has to choose between the persuasions of the spiritual scripture supporting the sadhu and the dissuasions of the whole phenomenal world, on the very threshold of the spiritual life. The decisive part is, therefore, played by one's own judgment. It is necessary to exercise one's judgment with a due sense of the far-reaching consequences to oneself that are involved. The scriptures as well as the sadhus can only persuade but can never compel the bound soul to accept the course of self-discipline that is absolutely necessary for self-realization. Sri Lakshmi Devi and Sri Vishnupriya Devi are the eternal consorts of the Supreme Lord and possess the special capacity of appearing with the Lord for the purpose of being visible in their actual forms to the bound souls in order to effect their deliverance. When it is further explained that Sri Lakshmi Devi is described in the scriptures as the power who is identical with beauty or law, the reader, who is not sufficiently mindful of the conditions to be fulfilled for the purpose of realizing the proper nature of the consorts of Godhead, may be disposed to suspect that the truth is being attempted to be figuratively set forth by a number of cleverly devised allegorical forms, and that it should be sufficient to bear in mind in the abstract the principles involved without taking the concrete side into serious consideration. The less skeptical may fall into the opposite inconsistency of attempting to take everything in its literal worldly sense. Both may unconsciously ignore the function of the sadhus being absolutely necessary for obtaining access to the reality. There are, of course, those who may maintain that if the reality cannot be realized without submitting to a sadhu as the condition of enlightenment, how can one be sure that the sadhu and his scriptures may not also mislead? They may also quote actual instances of persons who have gone astray, by admission of the sadhus themselves, after a course of training with them. The validity of the objection consists in the fact that the initiative in the form of choice of course ever lies, and must ever lie, with the individual soul. The sadhu, if he is not properly served, will remain absolutely unknown to the disciple after the longest period of apparently strenuous and faithful service. The truth will not submit to the dominating efforts of any individual soul, neither does he accept the compelled service of anyone. The pure soul accepts the whole responsibility of this position and is accordingly enabled to see the light by which to walk loyally. The polemic and disbelieving trifler with truth alone is ever effectively shut out from the realm of the absolute. The bound soul is accustomed to submit tentatively to hypothetical courses of instruction and training under hypothetical teachers of apparent truths. He is also insensibly but stubbornly disposed to carry the same procedure into the realm of the absolute. It is the function of the sadhu, of his own accord, to warn all erring souls against these confirmed errors of habit. It is for the individual soul himself to accept or reject the advice. Those who have undue faith in the tentative method resent the advice which they are naturally disposed to regard as uncalled for and mischievous. The tendencies never fully eradicated till one stands face to face with the reality. This is the cause of the risk and uncertainty that have to be faced by the novice, but they are quite inevitable and perfectly in accordance with the absolute position itself. So Sri Lakshmi Devi and Sri Vishnupriya Devi need neither be believed nor disbelieved as consorts of the divinity by anyone prior to understanding the nature of the relationship in which one is required by the conditions of the case to place himself in order to be enabled to grasp the issue of the advocates of realizable absolute truth. The issue need not be confounded with any hollow hypotheses of erring mortals, nor need it be conceded by one's condescending oral assent to possess the transcendental nature which is neither comprehensible by the intellect of the bound soul nor compatible in practice with any of his worldly interests. For such persons the proper attitude should be to try to understand the preliminary conditions with the help of the narrative and abstain from all opinions on the nature of the divine power herself till she has had time to explain what he requires to know further. These remarks hold also in the case of the third plenary power that ever accompanies the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna Caitanya whenever he chooses to appear in this world. She bears the name of Neela in the Shastras and is no other than the abode of Godhead, Sridhama. The place where the Lord appears in this world is his own plenary power, or eternal consort. This would dispose of the gross and profane speculations of the sensualist schools regarding the subject of divine amor, the relationship that subsists between the Lord and his plenary power Shribu and Neela, who bear the names of Lakshmi, Vishnupriya and Nabadwiptama in the transcendental vocabulary of the scriptures, whose natures are realizable only by the devotees of Lord Chaitanya. All this at the first sight cannot but appear to be bizarre and unsettling to all persons contentedly moving on the plane of three dimensions. Such persons may even affect to regard the statements as the products of a diseased imagination and their own fool's paradise as the undoubted abode of sanity and wisdom. But such a view does not remove every difficulty from the path even of those who choose deliberately to shut their ears to the pleadings of the rational instinct. The so-called mundane positivists want a real standing ground for their perverted speculations. Those wise persons cherish the wild faith that by putting the cart before the horse greater results are to be gained than by the ordinary method of obeying the voice of humdrum reason and bitter experience. The names Lakshmi, Vishnupriya, Nabadwip are not words denoting anything limited or worldly. Neither are they mere symbols or conceptions of any worldly entity. They are the divine consorts themselves. The transcendental nomenclature is inconceivable except by their grace identical with the mercy of Godhead himself, whoever acts through his plenary powers in his dealings with jivas who are dissociated emanations of the pure essence of his marginal potency. As a matter of fact, the activities of the Lord, even when he chooses to appear in this world, remain absolutely unintelligible to the conditioned soul as long as the latter persists in the attitude of refusal to seek the help of the plenary spiritual power of Godhead for realizing the same. For understanding the Leela of Sri Gauranga, it is necessary to approach the subject by willing, convinced and active submission to real sadhus who are the eternal servants of Sridhama and Abhidwap, the eternal realm of the divinity, who alone can confer the service of Lakshmi Devi and Vishnupriya Devi, who serve Sri Gaur Sundar with amorous devotion of the most distinctive delicious types that are comprehensible to conditioned souls only by their grace. This comprehension is the only proper goal of all individual souls gone astray and is identical with the service of Sri Sri Radha Govinda attainable in the unalloyed spiritual state. For these reasons we abstain from dealing with this subject more specifically at this place. The doings of the Lord as householder can be understood only in the light of the practice and teachings of the Lord as a sannyasin after his apparent renunciation of the world. The object of sitting at the feet of Sri Krishna Caitanya, the practicing ascetic teacher of the Absolute Truth, is to be enabled to understand, through the practice of service taught by himself by example and precept, the Absolute Truth as he is realizable by souls who appear to his loyal disciple in the form of Sri Gaur Sundar dwelling eternally in Sridham Nabadwap, served with amorous devotion by his consorts Sri Lakshmi Devi and Sri Vishnupriya Devi by the method of loving separation. Such realization can alone enable a conditioned soul to attain the highest service of the divine pair Sri Sri Radha Govinda on the termination of his wrong connection with the mundane plane. Chapters V. Triumphs of Learning. The Lord taught his pupils in all places. His usual resort for the purpose in the evening was the side of the Ganges. On his arrival there he took his seat, as at the academy, in the midst of his pupils. The performances of the Lord as teacher on the bank of the holy stream remained indelibly impressed on the memory of all beholders. Sri Brindavandas Thakur searched all the scriptures to find an analogy by an event of the triple universe. He rejected the following suggestions after due consideration of their claims. The analogy of the moon surrounded by the stars of heaven was rejected on the ground that the moon is spotted and subject to the processes of waxing and waning, whereas the nature of the spotless subject of comparison is eternally full. Brahaspati, teacher of the gods, does not furnish a proper analogy inasmuch as he happens to be a partisan of the devas, whereas our Lord is the partisan and help of all sides. Cupid, god of worldly umber, does not offer the requisites of a proper analogue. The mind in which he makes his appearance is distracted, whereas on the appearance of the Lord in one's mind all other bonds are snapped and the mind attains the state of supreme purity and satisfaction. In the same way all other analogies also appeared to be seriously defective. There could be found only one exception. There is real analogy with the pastimes of the son of Sri Nanda, surrounded by the cowherds, on the banks of the Kalindi, Yamuna. It seemed to all people as if the selfsame Krishna Chandra, in the company of those very cowherds, having put on the form of the twice-born, now reenacted his identical pastimes on the bank of the Ganges. All those, who were privileged to have the sight of the Lord discoursing to his pupils on the bank of the Ganges, experienced a gladness that baffles all description. They were no less impressed by the display of his power, and everybody secretly opened his mind to others on this subject. Some said, such power does not belong to man. Some declared that the Brahmana was the integral portion of Krishna himself. Others said that he seemed to be the person of the prophecy that a Brahmana will be king in Goa, and held that his conclusion was confirmed by the fact that he had all the bodily signs that prognosticate the King of Kings. Everyone made these remarks regarding the Lord in accordance with one's own particular bent of mind. The Lord expounded the scriptures on the bank of the Ganges, adversely criticizing the teachers. He exposed the falsity of their interpretations by establishing their contradictories and, after refuting all different opinions, re-established them all. He challenged everyone to disputation with himself and promised to recognize as a real scholar everyone who would fairly meet him only once. He denied that anyone possessed the power of holding his ground in controversy against him even by accepting the very interpretations that he offered. Thus did the Lord make his boast, and his bragging words destroyed all vanities of everyone who listened to them. There was no end of the pupils of the Lord. They formed themselves into innumerable groups and pursued their studies at many different places in the town. Every day 10 or 20 Brahmana boys prostrated themselves at the feet of the Lord and begged to be allowed to study under him. They prayed for his mercy that they might have the good fortune of being enlightened by him to the least extent. The Lord laughed at their words, observing that what they said was most excellent. The number of the Lord's pupils went on increasing apace every day in this manner. Thus the Lord held his learned sessions surrounded by his countless pupils by the side of the Ganges. It was a most edifying sight that was witnessed by his fortunate contemporaries. The whole of Nabadwip was rendered free from all cause of sorrow by the holy influence of the Supreme Lord, and all those who were privileged to witness the learned performances of the Lord were regarded in subsequent years as persons of rare good fortune, the very sight of whom had power to free one from the bondage of the world. Sri Brindavandas Thakur laments his misfortune for not having been born at that time, and cherishes the hope that he might retain his recollection of those activities of the Lord at every birth and be born as his servant wherever Sri Chaitanya and Nityananda manifest their divine activities. The above, from the pen of his first biographer, who had his information from Nityananda himself, contradicted by any other writers of that or subsequent period, proves conclusively, apart from the evidence of his associates and followers regarding the substantive teaching of the Lord, that Sri Chaitanya enjoyed an extraordinary reputation as disputant and exponent of the Shastras among his contemporaries. Those contemporaries were specially given to the cultivation of the science of polemics, which had been perfected at Nabadwip to a point never rivaled anywhere else either then or since. Lest this fact fail to be sufficiently grasped by posterity, Thakur Brindavandas repeats it over and over again and in a most definite manner. As for instance, he gives prominence to the fact that the Lord was never chary of denouncing the interpretations of other professors, although Nabadwip was at the time full of a countless host of the most eminent teachers, proverbially jealous of their scholastic reputation, to whose ears the denunciations of the Lord were sure to be carried in no time. But no professor in all the different branches of learning, which were cultivated with equal zeal at Nabadwip, ever dared to meet the Lord in open controversy on any issue. Everyone was terribly afraid of him, showed the greatest deference to his views, and avoided any direct disputation with him. And if the Lord was pleased to speak kindly to anyone, that fortunate person became at once his most devoted servant. All the people were fully aware of his extraordinary cleverness even from infancy, and all dreaded and obeyed him. They also knew that no one had really the power to excel or teach him anything new. Yet no one suspected that he was any other than an ordinary mortal. The language of Thakur Brindavandas, coming from one who, although an admirer of the Lord and using the poetic diction, and after making every allowance for so-called Oriental hyperbole that is supposed by unimaginative empiric thinkers of this country and elsewhere to specially characterize all religious literature, makes it plain that Sri Chaitanya was not a particularly submissive kind of a person, nor did he seek to serve Godhead in the current manner, but was certainly not an opponent of rational or even empiric inquiry on any subject. He was also at the same time a scoffer of all self-sufficient superficial pedantry. These qualities were misunderstood by the orthodox Vaishnavas also, among whom were persons distinguished for their secular learning as well as piety. This incomprehensible nature of the young professor, who scorned everybody and submitted to none, marked him out as a most extraordinary person and extorted the unwilling admiration of friends and foes alike. That it was not willing admiration in all cases we shall know from the sequel. His uncompromising attitude and hostile talk gave deep offense to the learned pedants, who only waited for the opportunity of indulging their furious animosity against the dreaded scholar whom they could not meet in honest controversy. The attitude of the learned circles of Nadia demonstrates the radical defect of empirical intellectualism, which does not at all realize the gravity of the misfortune of its divorce from the absolute truth. Its abstract idealistic speculations are a sorry refuge from the dangers of the grosser forms of materialistic positivism. This material world is not an illusion. The idealist, who affects to look down upon it, is bound to be brought to grief in no time by the actual force of the very circumstances that he pretends to condemn. The scientific instinct revolts from the sterile and fictitious triumphs of the mere idealist. It seeks to satisfy the need of our nature for the substantive truth by creating opportunities of expanded materialistic activities in defiance of barren idealism. Sri Gaur Sundar, however, did not meet the idealists with the weapon of grosser materialism. He was content to point out the glaring defect of their synthesis with the help of empiric logic itself, as they could not fail to understand such argument. By the very nature of the case, it is possible by means of empiric logic to demolish its own false constructions and to demonstrate the necessity of a change of method of investigation for the attainment of the real truth. The difficulty begins after this critical juncture has been reached. Even those who are prepared to admit their defect in controversy do not always realize the necessity of accepting the conclusions of their victorious enemy. The out-and-out sincerity of judgment that would lead to such acceptance is very rare and implies to an attitude of causeless devotion to the truth for his own sake. The pedants of Nabadwap did not care to learn the truth from Sri Chaitanya Deva. Neither is this an absolute and immediate drawback for progressing in empiric knowledge. A person can improve his empiric knowledge by self-application unassisted by any other person by the study of books. Sri Gaur Sundar led his campaign against the futility of this method for attainment of the knowledge of the Absolute. Such knowledge, he contended, can only be obtained by submitting to receive it from person who is in possession of it. The necessity of personal mediation of the teacher for attainment of the knowledge of the Absolute introduces a condition which it is not possible to establish fully by the method of empiric logic. The necessity of the acceptance of the principle of personal subordination is also consistently enough denied by the empiricists in respect of their own achievement. Their misunderstanding is due to the fact that they cannot realize the identity of the teacher of the Absolute with the message itself. They want to accept the message by leaving out the bearer of the same. They have evidently less respect and necessity for the servant than for the master. Their own logic should be able to tell them that the Absolute must by his nature be unattainable by any form of conditional submission. The mundane egoistic reservation is to be completely discarded if one is to approach the presence of Sri Krishna. The Bhattacharyas and Misras of Nabadwap, proud of their learning and fallacious self-sufficiency, failed to understand the necessity and duty of absolute submission to the real teacher of the Word of God. They preferred to continue on the path of admitted ignorance and sinfulness. This course appeared to them to be less intolerable than absolute submission to the servant of Krishna. Such persons are by temperament doomed to eternal perdition, and the only method that was applicable to their case was that of merciless castigation in the form of elaborate exposure of their sophistries, by which method alone they might be prevented from misleading less wicked foolish people from the path of the pure service of the Lord. The fact that the Bhattacharyas and Misras were not redeemed by Sri Gaur Sundar has been used by dishonest pedants who are not on principle prepared to inquire with an unbiased mind into the nature of the issue itself that divided the two parties as a circumstance that proves the unconvincing nature of the position taken up by Sri Gaur Sundar. There cannot well be a grosser form of impiety under the garb of piety than the unholy assertion that the suffrage of the ignorant people of this sinful world establishes the claim of the Absolute to our unconditional allegiance to his holy feet. Such perversity of judgment is the punishment that justly overtakes all insincere natures who, while professing to seek the truth, are willfully bent upon amassing the means for the gratification of their own ignorant vanity. To those abnormal people, the uncompromising attitude of Sri Gaur Sundar's advocacy of the truth appeared to be only an instance of ignorant arrogance greater than their own. They were so completely blinded by their insatiable passion for sensuous gratification that they were unable to distinguish between their own selfish vanity and the arrogance of Sri Gaur Sundar, which their own vanity necessitated and which was intended to break their impious perversity, or at any rate, to lessen the same, or prevent it from grossly misleading innocent people to the utter ruin of both. This attitude of Sri Gaur Sundar was also in glaring contrast to that of the other Vaishnavas who did not care to oppose in this drastic manner the pretensions of those graceless atheists. But it was nonetheless best calculated to promote the real well-being of all those who are disposed to draw a distinction between arrogance directed to the service of the Absolute and humility practiced with the same object in favor of the latter, make out difference which does not really exist. Real humility, that submits unconditionally to the Absolute, never submits to minister to the pleasures of the atheists. When those, who are not disposed to submit to the Absolute, pretend to be humble in their relations with worldly people, they do so for gaining the reputation of humility. The really humble person has no selfish ambition and is, therefore, in a position to serve the truth and nothing but the truth under all circumstances. The true and constant servants of the Absolute alone are privileged to understand how Godhead may be best served by loyal arrogance and most basely betrayed by self-seeking show of humility. Godhead is never served by external conduct. Good manners in themselves have no value. They have their value in and through perfect loyalty to the truth, which is the one thing needful. Good manners, practiced by worldly people, are but a snare and a most insidious form of gross impiety. The above considerations enable us to understand that no one can know the Lord unless the Lord makes himself known to him of his own accord. Sri Sundar, during all this period while he was engaged in the task of silencing the proud scholars of the center of learning of the age by exposing their utter ignorance of all subjects, failed to be recognized as the Lord of all learning alike by pious Vaishnavas and the atheistical teachers of Nabadwip. But we need not suppose that his activities were, therefore, less important or a lesser evidence of his highest beneficent mercy. The Lord is ever full of unlimited beneficence, but he reserves the right of manifesting the true nature of his divine activities only to such persons whom he chooses to favor. During all the time that Sundar was indulging in these learned pastimes, not a single person in the whole Nabadwip recognized his divinity, although these performances were most extraordinary even from the point of view of empiric scholarship. In this connection, the following remarkable incident which took place at this time deserves our most attentive consideration. A great scholar of the name of Keshab Bhatta came to Nabadwip. He was a famous controversialist and had assumed the proud title of conqueror of all quarters to proclaim his victories over the scholars of all parts, and also as an open challenge to the learned whom he summoned to recognize his superiority if they did not venture to engage in open discussion through fear of public exposure of their inferiority. It was the traditional ambition of the Pandits of this country to seek the proud distinction of being the recognized superior of all learned persons, or as the conqueror of all quarters, Digvijay. The conditions that such a claim gave rise to were that the vanquished had to put down in writing the fact of their defeat and hand over to the victor their written confession of inferiority. Keshab Bhatta, after defeating in controversy the Pandits of other parts of the country, appeared in Nabadwip, which was then reputed as the greatest center of learning in India, with the object of compelling the great Pandits of Nabadwip also to admit his superior scholarship. Keshab Bhatta was fully confident of his ability to defeat the Pandits of Nabadwip for the reason that he had ordained the assurance of the goddess of learning herself to the effect that he would never suffer any defeat in controversy. Keshab Bhatta had discovered that all the Shastras appeared on the tip of his tongue without any effort on his part by the grace of the goddess of learning, and the questions that constantly suggested themselves to him were such that no antagonist was ever in a position to offer any satisfactory reply. His questions alone were sufficient to silence his adversary, and it never came to a discussion at all. When the fame of Nabadwip reached his ears, he hastened thither in great state, escorted by a numerous retinue mounted on richly caparisoned horses and elephants, defeating controversial encounters all those Pandits who met his challenge on the way. His arrival at Nabadwip caused a great fear to fall upon the community of the Pandits, who took counsel together apprehending the imminent loss of the prestige which they enjoyed in the learned world if this conqueror of all quarters from afar succeeded in carrying off the laurels of victory by defeating them in their very stronghold. They were unnerved by fear at the prospect of contending with one whom Saraswati herself had been pleased to grant the boon of invincibility in controversy. All the leading Bhattacharyas of Nabadwip left off all work and racked their brains over their impending discomfiture. On every side the ominous cry was loudly expressed that the occasion had arrived which was to settle what gift of intellect the Pandits of Nabadwip really possessed. The students soon carried the tidings to Gauranga. A certain conqueror of the quarters, Digvijay, having won the favor of Saraswati, is touring all places and vanquishing in controversy all Pandits. He has in his possession the certificates of his victories from all the vanquished. He has a large following of horses, elephants, litters, attendants. He has recently arrived in the town and is actually settled in Nabadwip. He wants to engage in controversy any rival who may offer himself. If no antagonist is prepared to take up his challenge, he demands that every learned association must forthwith supply him with written confession of their defeat. On hearing this, the Lord laughingly told the truth to his pupils. Listen to me, brothers. I am telling you the real truth. The Supreme Lord in no way tolerates self-conceit. The Lord always takes away whatsoever intoxicates a person to indulge in excessive vanity. Humility is the constant nature of the fruit-bearing tree as of a person endowed with all good qualities. Have you not heard of the fate of all the mightiest conquerors of old, such as Hyai, Nahusha, Bena, Naraka, Ravana? Was there ever any person whose vanity was not brought low? Godhead never tolerates excessive conceit. For this reason I assure you that all the pride of his learning will be completely humbled at this very place. Having said so, the Lord came onto the bank of the Ganges in the evening with his disciples and, having touched with reverence the holy water of the Ganges and made his obeisance to the sacred stream, divine Gauranga assumed a seat in the center of his pupils. The students sat round him in many different groups, and a brisk and cheerful discussion went forward regarding many a topic on Dharma and the Shastras. As the Lord was seated in this joyous manner, he thought of a plan of conquering the conqueror of all quarters. He did not like the idea of defeating him in open controversy in a public assembly, as such defeat would kill outright the Brahmana who was so much puffed up with inordinate vanity by reason of his victories, which had filled him with the notion that he had no equal in the whole world. Moreover, such defeat would also expose him to the jeers and violence of the populace who would fall upon him and plunder his belongings. If the Brahmana were vanquished in a private encounter, he would be cured of his vanity without suffering the terrible pain of a public exposure. While the Lord was maturing his plan, the conqueror of all quarters himself came to the very spot that evening. What ensued after the arrival of the conqueror of all quarters has been graphically described in all its bearings by Thakur Brindavandas. The night was most beautifully illuminated by the gorgeous splendors of the clear moon of Bengal. The Bhagirathi wore her most hallowed aspect of indescribable glory. The Supreme Lord, whose beauty captivates the hearts of everything, was himself present with all his disciples. The charming face of the Lord was constantly lit up with a gracious smile, and his two beautiful eyes wore the eternal look of divine benediction. His fine teeth, set between his ruddy lips, scorned the beauty of pearls. His whole frame was most delicately soft and overflowed with kindness. His beautiful head wore a profusion of the most charming curls of the finest hair. His neck was posed like the lion's. His shoulders were broad as that of the elephant. His attire was in keeping with his figure. The holy form was of the most generous dimensions, with a most beautiful bosom which was encircled by Sri Anantadeva in the form of the sacrificial thread. His fine forehead was marked with the long beautiful tilaka pointing upwards. His exquisite hands reached to the knee. The Lord wore his cloth in the style of the Yogapada and, being seated with his right foot placed in the loop of the left thigh, was engaged in expounding the Shastras, establishing the contraries of all negative and positive conclusions. All his disciples were seated in many a group, on different sides of him, and formed a most picturesque assembly. The conqueror of all quarters was much surprised on beholding this wonderful sight, and thought within himself, "Is this perhaps Nimai Pundit?" And, stopping unnoticed, gazed on the beauty of the Lord without taking off his eyes for a long time. He then inquired of one of the disciples, "What is his name?" and was told in reply, "He is, indeed, the great Nimai Pundit himself." Thereupon, making his obeisance to the Ganges, the conqueror made his way into the midst of the assembly of the Lord. A slight smile played round the lips of the Lord as he welcomed him with cordiality, inviting him to take a seat. The conqueror of all quarters was of a most fearless disposition, but nevertheless he experienced a feeling of great awe at the sight of the Lord. The Lord, after exchanging a few words with the Brahmana, began to be inquisitive in his joyous mood. He began by observing that the poetic powers of the conqueror were boundless, and there was no subject to which he could not apply his powers with success. That they would all be delivered from their sins if he would favor them with a poetic account of the glories of the holy Ganges. On hearing these words of the Lord, the conqueror began immediately the praise of the Ganges in verses composed on the spot, and with such facility and in such varied figures that his recitation appeared to possess the amplitude and dignity of the voice of the clouds. Saraswati herself was present on the tongue of the conqueror, and, therefore, whatever he said was perfect in every way. No human being possessed the power of impeaching the same, or even comprehending the full extent of the profound learning that marked his utterances. All the students of the Lord, who were counted by thousands, were astonished by listening to the description. "Rama, Rama," they ejaculated, "it is most wonderful. Can such words come from any mortal?" The description was most richly laden in every part with all the rhetorical embellishments conceivable for adorning the human speech that are to be found in the whole world, and to such supreme perfection that even those who were deeply versed in all branches of the Shastras found it most difficult even to follow him. In this fashion the conqueror spoke on for the space of a quarter of the night and did not yet finish. When the conqueror at last ceased, Sri Gaur Sundar said laughingly that the real purpose of the words woven into the verses by him was not intelligible to them unless he himself was pleased to explain. He would, therefore, request the conqueror to supply the explanation of his own words, which were undoubtedly perfect in their import. These sweet words of the Lord induced the conqueror to an attempt to explain his own verses. But no sooner did he begin to expound, the Lord began to criticize at every step. The Lord said in effect that the words that had been employed by the conqueror apparently transgressed against all the established principles of the Shastras, and that it was, therefore, necessary to know all other special purpose which the conqueror had in view in using them. The great conqueror of all quarters, the pet child of the goddess of learning, the victor of 100 controversies, was powerless to offer any explanation, and all his intelligence seemed to desert him at this crisis. The Brahmana began to talk at random, but could establish nothing, and Sri Gauranga was most prompt in pointing out all the defect of his arguments. All the genius of the conqueror forsook him, and he did not understand what he himself had said. Then the Lord asked him not to mind it but give them something fresh. But the conqueror found that he no longer possessed his former power of impromptu composition. When the conqueror of all quarters was in the throes of the agony of his decisive defeat, the pupils of the Lord made a gesture of laughter at his expense. But the Lord forbade all incivility and spoke kindly to the Brahmana. The conqueror had made an exhausting effort by composing those wonderful verses and was naturally very much fatigued by his exertions. The night was far advanced, so the controversy might be postponed to the next day. Let them all part for that night with mutual goodwill, and the conqueror should return to his lodgings for rest without feeling discouraged. The Lord was ever tender to his opponents in his dealings with them. Those whom he vanquished in controversy did not experience any sorrow. The Lord behaved in the same way towards all the professors of Nabadwip. Although he defeated them all, he pleased them all by his conduct after his victory. Let us, he would say, go home today and look up our authorities so that we might be in a position to answer everything correctly tomorrow. The Lord never broke the spirit of the vanquished, hence all were pleased with him. Such were the pastimes of the Lord. It was for this reason that every one of all those pandits who lived at Nabadwip was in his heart of hearts well disposed towards the Lord. The Lord made his way home in the company of his disciples. The conqueror of all quarters felt extremely ashamed at heart. In his distress the Brahmana thus mused within himself, Saraswati herself gave me this boon. I have met in controversy all those who were well versed in Nyashankya, Tanyala, Mimamsa, Vaishika and Vedanta philosophies. I found none in the whole world who could even advance a plausible view in opposition to mine. The question of their ability to defeat me was, therefore, necessarily remote. But such is the contrivance of Providence that this Brahmana, who is merely a teacher of Vyakarana, which is a subject for infants, should be able to actually defeat me. The boon of Saraswati herself would seem to be unsure. There is good cause for the greatest anxiety in this. Some offense against the goddess must have been engendered in myself, and due to this the power of my genius has been lessened. I must find out the cause of it this very day. Thinking thus, the Brahmana sat down to the recitation of the mantra and, having finished the duquota, betook himself to his bed with a sorrowful heart. In his dream Saraswati appeared before the Bipra and, casting her merciful glance on the fortunate Brahmana, began to tell him secrets that are most carefully hidden in the scriptures. Saraswati said, "Listen, good Brahmana, I am going to tell you the hidden secret of the Vedas. If you disclose this to anyone, your life will assuredly be cut short. He, at whose hands you have suffered defeat, is most assuredly the Lord of the endless universe. He is, indeed, the self-same Lord whose lotus feet I ever serve. I feel ashamed of myself even to appear before him. My function is to delude all creatures into the vanities of the false ego. This function has no admission into the sphere that is lighted up by the glance of Vasudeva. It is I who speak through your tongue, but I have no power in his divine presence. It is not merely my little self who feels so helpless, but even the divine Sheshadeva himself, who expounds the Vedas by his 1,000 mouths and is the worshipped of Aya, Baba and all the great gods, is bewildered in the presence of the Supreme Lord whom you have seen face to face in the form of the Brahmana. He is transcendently great, eternal, pure, indivisible, irredible, and is present in his fullness in the hearts of all. From him proceeds work, knowledge, learning, all good and evil, the visible and the invisible, in fact everything which it is not possible for me to fully recount to you. All the creatures from Brahma downwards who are subject to suffering undergo tribulation by his command. All the avatars, such as the fish, tortoise, etc., of whom you have heard, are no other than he. It is the same Lord who restores the world in his form of the boar, the same who protects Prahlada in his form of man-lion. He is the life of Bali in his form of Vaimana, whose lotus feet are the source of the holy Ganges. It is he who appeared in Ayodhya and killed the wicked Ravana by his endless wonderful activities. Him we call the son of Vasudeva and Nanda. He is at present, as the son of Brahmana, actively engaged in the pleasures of learning. Not even the Veda himself is aware of his appearance in the world. One can know him only if he makes himself known. Who has power to know otherwise? All the mantras that you have recited to me up till now are not really fulfilled by yielding as their fruit the status of the conqueror of all quarters. The real fruit of my mantra you have at last obtained only now, inasmuch as you have had a direct sight of the Lord of the countless worlds. Vipra, go quickly to his feet and surrender your body to him. Don't consider these words as an idle dream. I have divulged to you the hidden knowledge of the Vedas under the influence of the mantra. Saying this, the goddess Saraswati disappeared and the Brahmana woke up from his sleep. The Brahmana immediately made his way, at early dawn, to the presence of the Lord. The Vipra made prostrated obeisances to the Lord, who thereupon lifted him up into his arms. The Lord asked, "Brother, what is the meaning of this behavior?" The Vipra made reply, "Even so is the merciful glance of thy eyes." The Lord asked, "Being yourself conqueror of all quarters, why do you behave in this way to me?" The conqueror said, "Deign to listen, Prince of Brahmanas, all work is fulfilled by serving thee. Thou art Narayana in the form of the twice-born in the Kali age. Who has power to recognize thee?" The suspicion grew in my mind the moment my power of speech deserted me as thou questioned. "Thou art declared by all the scriptures to be the breaker of all worldly vanity. I have truly experienced this undoubted truth. Thou overcame me 3 times and yet preserved my reputation. Is this possible otherwise than by the power of the Supreme Lord himself? Wherefore it is most certain that thou art Narayana. In all the learned societies of the world, in Gauda, Trihat, Delhi, Kasi, Gujarat, Vijayanagar, Kanchipuri, Anga, Vanga, Telanga, Adra and other places, there is no scholar who could even understand my words, far less find fault with them. I, who am so clever, failed to establish anything in thy presence. Whither did all my wits depart? This feat of thine is not at all wonderful. The goddess of learning herself told me that thou art her lord. Most auspicious, indeed, was the planetary conjunction under which I let my foot at Nabadwap, that I, so sunk in the deep mire of the world, have obtained the sight even of thyself. Bewitched by the wily entanglements of ignorant selfish desires, I have long wandered astray, utterly deceiving myself. By good fortune I have now obtained the sight of thee. Be pleased to deliver me by thy merciful glance. It is thy nature to do good to all. There is no one except thyself who is the refuge and who is truly merciful. Be pleased, Great One, so to instruct me that there may never again arise any evil desire in my mind. The conqueror of all quarters, most humbled, praised the Lord in many various ways in terms of sincere penitence. On hearing the fervent words of the Brahmana, Sri Gaurasundar smiled as he thus replied, "Listen, illustrious Brahmana. You, on whose tongue Saraswati herself abides, are, indeed, most fortunate. The use of learning does not lie in conquering all quarters. That scholarship alone is genuine which serves the Supreme Lord. Consider this well and attentively. When a person leaves his body, his wealth or any human qualifications never accompany their quondam possessor. It is for this reason that all who are pure-souled apply themselves with a firm purpose to serve the Supreme Lord, discarding every other occupation. Therefore, Vipra, giving up all evil ways, make haste to worship the feet of Sri Krishna without delay, and continue to serve Krishna with firm conviction until you are overtaken by death. Know for certain that the only due fruit of learning is obtained if one's mind and work continue to abide thereby at the lotus feet of Sri Krishna. I declare to you the highest advice. Devotion to Vishnu is the one thing that is true in all these countless worlds." Having said so, the Supreme Lord, being pleased with the Brahmana, embraced him. Being favored by the embrace of the Lord of Vaikuntha, the twice-born was released from all his worldly fetters. The Lord said, "Brahmana, give up all vanity. Take to the service of Krishna by being merciful to all beings. Whatever Saraswati might have told you, never divulge to anyone else. By speaking out the hidden truth of the scriptures, the span of life is cut short, and such a person verily suffers the bad consequences of such conduct in the next world." The great Brahmana, on receiving the command of the Lord and after making many prostrated obeisances to him and repeatedly doing homage to his lotus feet, departed thence, having thus obtained the highest fulfillment of all his endeavors. By the command of the Lord, that very instant, devotion, want of attachment to things mundane, and the true knowledge manifested themselves simultaneously in the person of that Brahmana. The vanity of being conqueror of all quarters completely disappeared. The Vipra became humbler than a blade of grass, After bestowing on fit persons the gift of every earthly possession that he had, his elephants, horses, conveyances, wealth and all equipments, that conqueror of all quarters set out on his journey companionless. Such is the pastime of Sri Gaurasundar. It is the natural quality of his mercy that a person, who obtains it, betakes himself to the occupation of begging, giving up the kingly state. In this college Sri Debarkas bore testimony to the truth of this by preferring the retreat of the forest to a princely position. Wealth and power, which are coveted by all the world, are discarded by the servant of Krishna after having been gained. The state of a king and such other temporal things are deemed pleasant only just so long as one is ignorant of the bliss of devotion. Even the pleasure of emancipation from all the miseries of the world is considered by the devotees of Krishna as trivial, not to speak of such happiness as accrues from the possession of kingdoms and other coveted things of this world. Nothing is of any worth except the kind glance of the Supreme Lord, for which reason all the scriptures proclaim only the service of the Lord. Thus did the conqueror of all quarters obtain his final deliverance. Such is the wonderful career of Sri Gaurasundar. The news of the Lord's victory over the conqueror quickly spread to all parts of Nadia. All the people were overwhelmed with astonishment and instinctively realized that Nimai Pandit was undoubtedly a very great scholar. They had not yet heard of another scholar who could have defeated the conqueror. They confessed that Nimai Pandit had every justification for his pride, and it was only now that the real greatness of his learning was made patent to all. Some said if he had only read Nyaya he could have easily attained the position of Bhattacharya. Some proposed that all the people should join together and confer on him the title of Vadasimha, Lion of Controversy. These estimates, says Thakur Brindavandas, show the triumph of his deluding power who prevented the people from recognizing his divinity, even after they had seen all this. Thus all over Nadia all the people discoursed about the achievement of the Lord. The citizens of Nabadwap are worthy of the homage of everybody inasmuch as they are privileged to witness these activities of the Lord. Those, adds Thakur Brindavandas, who listen to this narration of the victory of the Lord over the conqueror of all quarters, never have any further occasion of suffering defeat in their own case. We reserve the treatment of this remark of Thakur Brindavandas for the next chapter. Chapters v. Significance of Scholastic Triumphs. I have tried to reproduce almost verbatim the account of Sri Thakur Brindavandas in describing the controversial triumph of Nimai Pandit over the conqueror of all quarters. Technical details of the controversy also have been handed down to us in the narrative of the same event in the immortal work of Sri Krishnadas Kavira Goswami. The shloka which was condemned by Sri Gaurasundar runs as follows. Mahatvam Ganga Sathatamidam Avadi Nitaram Yadesa Sri Vishnoshkarana Kamalat Padisubkagad Vitya Sri Lakshmriva Suranar Ararkya Karana Babanibharturya Shirasi Bibhavatyad Bhutaguna. Sri Gaurasundar pointed out in detail the defective disposition and use of words and the incorrectness of rhetorical embellishments used in the shloka, while admitting specific excellences. He observed that the 5 principal defects pointed out by him were the most prominent ones, but there were also other and numerous minor defects. He said that the productions of the greatest poets such as Kalidas, Bababhuti, Jyadeva, etc., were not also free from all defect. And so it was not necessary for the conqueror to be discouraged, inasmuch as he certainly possessed the poetic genius which is so rare. The power of learning that ever serves the Supreme Lord does not mislead anyone, but worldly learning always misleads her votaries. This is not the age-long controversy of theology versus natural science, as both of them are equally the products of the erring reason of man. The issue is the higher one. Is the absolute attainable by empiric knowledge? Nimai Pandit held the view that empiric knowledge is necessarily defective, i.e., untrue, by the standard of the absolute. Instead of helping us to find the truth, empiric knowledge produces a delusive belief in the sufficiency of itself, and thus acts as an obstacle in the way of the search of the truth. All mental speculation as a matter of fact is non-spiritual by its unavoidable neglect to make due allowance for inherent limitations. It is never possible for the reason of man to discover the absolute truth by its unavoidably limited speculative efforts. The conqueror of all quarters was, however, aware of this. He knew, what ordinary scholars will be hardly prepared to admit, that it was the goddess of learning who was the cause of his genius. If this were fully admitted by everybody, then all differences detectable in such knowledge would be proved to be fictitious and be at once seen as due to the operation of an invisible controlling power who also produces and keeps up the idea of human merit as the resultant of human effort. The conqueror was aware of the conditional nature of his knowledge, but the conqueror himself had not realized the utter delusiveness of all worldly learning. He accordingly aspired to the fame of being the acknowledged leading scholar of the world. The greatest theologians and the greatest scientists are but puppets in the hands of the goddess of illusion, if either of them suppose that they can know the truth by their limited effort. Sri Jiva Goswami Prabhu is not a controversialist of the mundane stamp. His arguments can never be really grasped by even the greatest or empiric thinkers of this world. Sri Jiva Goswami refutes his antagonists by arguments that are intelligible to empiricists for overthrowing the conclusions of a faulty system. He, however, knew that he was actually the channel of communication of the one living indivisible knowledge to all impartial understandings in the form of the articulated transcendental sound. Sri Jiva Goswami's sole ambition was to serve as the unobstructive medium of the divine communication. He is, as a matter of fact, not in the scale of comparison with the empiric scholars of this world. All comparison between one empiric scholar and another is mundane and delusive. The futile speculation of one man is by its nature challengeable by the equally abortive rival speculation of another man. This opens the way to the vicious cycle of the endless and inconclusive controversy that passes in the name of theology. All this controversy is untrue and never takes us an inch in the direction of the truth. In the picturesque language of Srimad Bhagavatam, it is futile to expect the discovery of the grain by thrashing the empty chaff. Empiric knowledge has not legs to stand upon. It rests on unproved and unprovable assumptions. It assumes the principle of limitation itself as the basis of its search for the unlimited. Can there be conceived a greater or more absurd form of self-deception than this? The conqueror was the favored protege of the goddess of the delusive empiric learning. All the empiric sciences accordingly yielded up their whole wealth of hypothetical truths to him, without any acquisitive effort on his part. The ideal of the empiric quest is the unrealizable wild goose of the fable. Let us suppose that it is possible for one to know everything that it is possible or desirable for one to know, and whenever one is in actual need of such knowledge, will the possession of such power yield or produce in such a person the inclination for the absolute truth? If I could attain every facility that is conceivable to the human reason as desirable possession without any effort, would it be the really satisfactory state of existence that it is conceived to be? This was the actual condition of the conqueror of all quarters. But he felt as solitary as Faust himself in his bad eminence. But there is no tempter except one's own boundless vanity of the hankering for empiric knowledge. The attempt to shift the responsibility of our sons to the shoulders of a third party is most disingenuous, since it is so easy to explain our own responsibility for our sins without the profanity of any such deliberately dishonest assumptions. The paltry reason of men, when it takes upon itself to shape its own course, finds itself reaping the harvest of its deliberate folly. It could foresee well enough the inevitable consequences of its attempt to dominate the world, if it could only properly exercise the sense of its responsibility for its acts, which it undoubtedly possesses. The exercise of the egotistic principle, on the part of a being with limited faculties of knowledge, is bound to lead to discord and misery. The plea is sometimes advanced that the miseries of this world are unreal. They do not really affect those who possess sufficient firmness of disposition. This is the Stoics' philosophy, but it is the most fatal form of all delusions. It is hardly prepared to deny the reality of misery in the case of those who do not possess the required imaginary firmness of disposition. It finds itself occupied in applauding the qualities of the unfeeling stone and the hardened criminal. This mechanical unconcern is not capable of being recognized even by the limited intellect as the ideal of human perfection. The miseries of this world are not really ended by such suicidal policy. It is necessary to seek out the true cause of our miseries for effecting their real and lasting cure. Empiric science is, at any rate, free from the killing vice of callousness of the Stoics. Its defect is not that it at all undertakes to search for the truth, but that it deliberately undertakes to do this in the evidently wrong way. The empiric optimist is, however, nevertheless cousin german of the empiric pessimist. The forte of both is an egregious egotism which both of them mistake for the principle of their coveted individuality and personality, and for which they heroically prepare themselves to take all fictitious risks. This is no doubt Rankathism, which is the antagonist against whom all this preparation is directed. There is no Satan in this world except one's own avoidable egotistic vanity. The conqueror of all quarters was happily disillusioned and gave up all worldly ambition to follow the true spiritual path. It is necessary to consider the means by which such a result was produced, as also the nature of the change itself. This great change was wrought by the mercy of Sri Gaur-Sundar. The goddess of learning directed the conqueror to the feet of Nimai Pandit. The same goddess was thus performing a double and apparently contradictory function. She had herself hitherto produced the delusion from which she now chose to rescue her victim. For the previous sufferings of the conqueror, the goddess was not to blame at all. She is ever contriving to save the perverse soul from the consequences of his suicidal folly, without allowing him to succeed in actually destroying himself. Her function is like that of the wise mother who deludes her wayward child with toys that have no intrinsic worth in order to wean the naughty child from the consequences, present and prospective, of his wantonness. The culpable egotistic sentiment is inherent in free cognition and is controllable only by the conviction of its possessor that it is wrong. This is at once the privilege and the danger of the soul of man poised between the spiritual and mundane worlds. The jiva possesses as his birthright perfect freedom to abuse his cognitive liberty. The empiric sciences of this world provide the scope for the abuse of his liberty. The sciences themselves are not to blame for this. As a matter of fact, they are never created by, but are only communicated to, the mind of man. The conqueror had realized this truth. Modern scientists, as a rule, do not admit this, nor do they admit its corollary that the empiric sciences only serve to conceal the truth more effectively. This last fact was also unknown to the conqueror. But inasmuch as he was fortunately immune from the more fatal of the above two defects, he proved to be of a more governable disposition. Mother Saraswati accordingly directed him to the Lord who alone could deliver him from his ignorance. It is only by the positive appearance of the truth that untruth loses its power over us. The Supreme Lord is the sole director of all the power of learning. We want our so-called acquired learning to serve our own selfish purposes and not for serving the purpose of the Lord. But learning refuses to serve anyone except the Lord. When she seems to serve us, she only puts on a deceptive appearance in order to delude us for our benefit, by the will of the Lord. This deception is continued as long as we retain the least inclination to be her master. As a matter of fact, we can never be her master. We serve her even when she seems to serve us, although this is contrived by her with such consummate skill that we find ample scope for serving her purpose even by our vanity of being her master. It is our own irrational attitude that is solely responsible for the deception that is thus provided by the mercy of the Supreme Lord for our redemption. The goddess of learning ever serves the Supreme Lord, and she serves only him. This is inconceivable to our limited understanding. We are ever striving to learn the so-called deluding secrets of nature. Such striving would be meaningless if we didn't expect to be rewarded with success in the shape of the attainment of material results yielding worldly facilities. The power to be able to compose impromptu verses is one of such facilities. The verses actually composed by the conqueror were in praise of the holy Ganges, and such performance might therefore appear to have been of a spiritual nature. But the conqueror was praising the Ganges only in order to win fame for himself. Every learned activity of empiric reason necessarily aims at some such definite selfish result. Empiric learning has its face always and necessarily directed towards the selfish interests of its ignorant victim. The so-called disinterested pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, so loudly advertised by the empiric pedants, is a misnomer as applied to the inductive and deductive processes of the mental principle professing to engage itself in unraveling the so-called mysteries of the mundane world. It is not at all disinterested. Behind it all lies the insincere conviction that knowledge will bring power to its possessor. It is the possession and enjoyment of power over nature that can be the only logical goal of all worldly learning. However proud we may be of this learning, it is permissible to question the conclusion that it has any real use for us. Is not the whole affair an example of repeating a foolish experiment even after its exposure? We are apt to assume that our knowledge is the cause of the so-called progress of mundane civilization. We are punished and disillusioned by the ever-present possibility of the wheels of this worldly civilization irrevocably going back at any moment. If knowledge has to be kept up to the teaching of experience by the process of its constant revision, is it not thereby proved to be always really inapplicable to any event? If what we are pleased, on insufficient grounds, to call the cause of an event, turns out to be no such thing, can we blame anybody excepting ourselves for neglecting this foregone conclusion? The laws of mathematics, we say, have proved perfectly reliable ever since the dawn of human civilization, and are accordingly inferred to be absolutely true. And it is also expected that they will remain true for all time. There are certain so-called fundamental principles which are also supposed to be true. All this is, on the face of it, self-contradictory. What then is the real value of this experience? The whole position is entirely relative to the nature of our present senses and shares all their defect. The senses do not give us the correct information. Our unbiased reason tells us that they cannot also give us the true information, as the temporary have no capacity of apprehending the absolute reality. The knowledge that our senses yield is one of the changing phenomena of this world. It cannot understand itself. If it were possible to know the truth, would we still have the temporary use of our empiric knowledge? The conqueror, at any rate, gave up once for all any further acquisitive effort. He must have realized the utter uselessness of such knowledge. We learn that he lived to write theological works that have come down to us, embodying his reasons for forsaking the empiric quest. So his activities did not stop altogether. But a race of theological writers and priests by themselves do not supply the ideal state of worldly existence. The world is sufficiently bad as it is, but it would be worse by such a change for the reason that even material civilization is preferable to fanatical barbarism. But are we absolutely sure that material civilization or material barbarism is producible by the effort of the will of man? The philosophical answer should be in the negative. But if we change the form of the question and ask, is the knowledge of the absolute truth attainable by man? We at once find the right track. The conqueror was evidently satisfied that it is possible to know the truth. Our responsibility in the matter is very great indeed. If the truth is knowable, we cannot be excused if we deliberately neglect to find him. It is said that the truth is to be found in the scriptures. This is denied by the Upanishads, which declare that there are two kinds of learning or knowledge, viz. The transcendental knowledge, and 2. Knowledge that is not so. The Vedas and all branches of study are classed as the textbooks of non-transcendental learning. The transcendental learning is declared to be that by which the transcendental truth is known. The Bhagavatam declares that if a person, who is thoroughly versed in the scriptures, be not conversant with the transcendental, then his efforts in the acquisition and preservation of such learning have no more value than the labor that is wasted in tending a dry cow. A distinction is made between the phenomenal and the transcendental. Learning as such, whether in the form of theology or otherwise, is lumped together as non-transcendental. The knowledge of the scriptures is not differentiated from that of any other branch of study. Neither is knowledge condemned. It is declared that non-transcendental knowledge is subordinate to the transcendental, and that the possession of the transcendental knowledge automatically and perfectly settles our relation to non-transcendental knowledge and teaches us the proper use of empiric knowledge. We need not be haunted with the impertinent fears of a conspiracy for the suppression or preservation of material civilization. The question at issue does not affect our material prospects, which are quite safe in the hands of Providence. But the method to be pursued seriously concerns the prospects of the individual soul for regaining his natural spiritual condition. Transcendental knowledge cannot be acquired by the inductive or deductive empiric processes. The first step that is to be taken in the direction of the attainment of such knowledge is to try to be convinced of the necessity of submitting to receive him at the hands of the Supreme Lord. Godhead himself is the absolute knowledge. He alone can make himself known to us. He is free in his choice to make himself known to us. We also may or may not want to know him. We do not really want to know him so long as we do not want to serve him. The Supreme Lord may be known only by the method of complete submission. Perfect submission is an indispensable condition of the attainment of such knowledge. The necessity and nature of complete submission is not conceivable except by the mercy of the Lord. The Lord is spontaneously all-merciful. We come under the influence of his mercy the moment we are at all really inclined to submit to him. This inclination is sometimes produced by the shock of utter worldly humiliation. It was so in the case of the conqueror. It came to him as the consequence of his defeat in controversy by the Lord. The mercy of the Supreme Lord often comes in the shape of defeat and humiliation. No one except the actual recipient of the divine favor can perceive his appearance. We gather all this from the writings of Keshavbhata himself, who was favored by the Supreme Lord. The goddess of learning ever serves her Lord. She directs the erring empiric scholar to the real knowledge when he is at all inclined to serve the truth. The endless experiments with the finite that nowadays absorb all intellectual efforts of men are not undertaken for the purpose of finding the truth. Very few of those who busy themselves with the acquisition of worldly learning, and fewer still of those who attain fame and success, In such pursuit, attain to the inclination to suspect the utter worthlessness of empiric scholarship in itself. They seldom seriously put the question to themselves, what shall we do with this deluding and changing knowledge? Most people take it for granted that empiric knowledge is desirable because it is valued by all people of this world. It is supposed to increase our chances of happiness. It is only those who do not feel sufficiently satisfied by the prospect who ask the further question, what is the value of the proposed happiness itself? It is in this last form that the call for the quest of the absolute makes its first appearance to the individual consciousness. So long as the lure of worldly prospects continue to dominate the mind, one can hardly be expected to pay any serious attention to the voice of the higher reason that is always speaking to everybody from within. It is only when a person actually shapes his external conduct in conformity with such prompting that he is in a position to obtain the realized mercy of the Supreme Lord. Vanity in all its forms stands in the way of our real conversion to the free spiritual service of the Absolute. Sri Gaur Sundar showed his extraordinary mercy to the conqueror of all quarters by defeating him in controversy in such a way that the vanquished was enabled to realize, for the first time in his life, his own utter helplessness in the presence of a mere boy who taught nothing higher than Vyakarana. This proved to be an exceptionally favorable spiritual conjunction for the conqueror, who was actually enabled to realize its supreme significance for himself by the grace of the goddess of learning whom he had worshipped so long for a vain purpose. It is likely that really great scholars may be in a slightly better position than others to be able to realize the utter worthlessness of all empiric scholarly achievements. But it is rarely that this saving truth is rightly grasped and acted upon by anyone in this world of his own accord. The spiritual instinct, the effective hankering for the unalloyed truth, is not the result of any worldly merit or demerit. But as soon as the first dim reflection of the light of truth begins to irradiate the dark chambers of the mind, it automatically drives out the desire of all worldly possession. The mind realizes that the truth has made his appearance, not as the result of the intensity of its professed quest for the truth of whom it had no idea previously, but in spite of its bungling activity calculated to shut him out altogether. The process of spiritual enlightenment is not of the nature of the last term of a continued mathematical series, neither does it result in the destruction of all previous experience. It should rather be regarded as the fulfillment of all previous activities. With the appearance of the Absolute, however, there is an end of all deficiency, unwholesomeness and ignorance. We now know the full truth, and, in this sense, enlightenment is its own fulfillment. It also disillusionizes. The whole body of the old knowledge is seen to be utterly insubstantial and positively delusive. The shadow had all along been mistaken for the substance. The nature of the shadow is truly realizable only after one's acquaintance with the substance. There is then no more chance of the shadow being mistaken for the substance. It is no doubt a rude shock to be awakened in this manner. The conqueror confessed that the first suspicion that he had of the actual approach of the truth was caused by his absolute collapse at the very sight of the Lord. The darkness, which had been so fondly cherished, was found powerless to oppose the advent of the living light. The first experience of the transcendental requires to be carefully distinguished from the invasion of hallucination. The transcendental is not anything that is opposed to the laws of physical nature. It is not anything abnormal. It is not a monstrosity. It neither confounds nor stupefies, but enlightens. It does not destroy anything except ignorance. We understand for the first time the real meaning of all those things with which we had been already familiar. All this happens without any initiative on one's part and by the mere sight of the truth, who is no other than the divine person himself. The goddess of learning told the conqueror that he had at last gained the real reward of his devotion to her by obtaining the sight of the Lord. But, as a matter of fact, Sri Gaur Sundar was being actually seen by all the people of Nadia, who failed to experience any such spiritual consequences. There is a difference between worldly seeing and spiritual seeing. The term seeing has to be used to express the new process in order to make the fact at all intelligible to the ignorant people of the world. But spiritual seeing is very different from, although certainly analogous to, the process of worldly seeing. In the former, the object to be seen takes the initiative, while in the latter the initiative seems to lie with the person who sees. That which we seem to see on our own initiative is the shadow. In such seeing we approach only such objects that are bound to show themselves to us the moment we choose to look at them. The object has no option but to be seen. Nay, it is bound to submit itself to the inspection of our senses as soon as we are in a position to choose to inspect. This process of knowing applies only to matter, limited existence, or the shadow. The substantive reality is spiritual and possesses the initiative. Why do we never see the soul of man? Because we are content with the sight of the material case, which seems readily enough to submit to our sensuous inspection. The material eye can see only matter. The soul does not see matter as substance. He is not under the necessity of curtailing or distorting his naturally perfect vision. One is no loser if his faculty of vision ceases to be eclipsable by the interposition of an opaque body. The soul sees, through all obstacles, the object. He sees the obstacle as the enveloping shadow of the substance. There is thus no loss of cognitive power by the spiritual process. The soul, in his normal state of an eclipsed spiritual condition, is privileged to have the sight of the reality. This privilege he forfeits the moment he begins to function in this material world. His faculty of vision is eclipsed, as he now sees through the colored glasses of the material eyes, which function is on the level of the plane of this world. But he is no gainer by the change, as his knowledge of his own self is also correspondingly obscured. The conditioned soul functions in this world by allowing himself to be personated by a material substance which he is compelled to mistake for himself. But his adventitious second self is not really his servant, but always behaves as his master and makes him undergo in proxy the disappointments of his unnatural identification with its insubstantial existence. It is no privilege or widening of existence for the substance to be reduced to the serfdom of a shadow. The all-soul is never subject to any such obscuration. It is only the jiva soul, who is a detachable particle of the potency of the all-soul, who is liable to succumb to his limiting power. The conqueror had the spiritual vision of the Lord. The people of Nadia also saw the Lord, but with their material eyes and necessarily as an entity of this world. But the conqueror, no sooner did he see the Lord than he believed him to be more than human. In fact, the Lord made himself known to him at the very first sight. No one can recognize the Lord unless he makes himself known. This applies to all spiritual entities. They have an unstinted sight of one another in the Lord so long as they serve the Lord by the boundless measure of the perennial requirements of such service. The Lord strictly reserves the right of remaining unrecognized by all till he chooses to make himself known to anyone out of his own causeless mercy. As soon as the Lord permitted the conqueror of all quarters to have the real sight of himself, all the learning of which he supposed himself to have been the master came forward in the living form of the spiritual power that ever serves the Lord, and made herself known to him as she really is. The goddess of learning is that power whereby the Lord makes himself known to the cognitive faculty of the jiva. She is part and parcel of the divinity himself. But she is not herself the master. She is power and not possessor of power. She is, however, power with personality and function under the supreme and exclusive direction of the divine will. In this she resembles souls in the state of grace. The conqueror had been unable to know her real nature as long as he had been trying to make use of her for purposes other than the service of the Lord. But when the Lord was pleased to be merciful to the conqueror, the goddess, by the will of the Lord, instead of misleading now, made known to the conqueror the real nature of the Lord, which is, indeed, the legitimate function of all learning. The conqueror, who had supposed that he was master of all the shastric learning, now discovered that he had misunderstood everything. He also realized the fact that no one can know the Lord by one's own aspiring efforts. The goddess directed her votary to make his unconditional submission to the Lord without delay. When the Lord asked him why he, the conqueror of all quarters, had chosen to submit to him, Keshav Bhattu replied that everything is fulfilled by serving the Lord. The spiritual service of the Lord, resting upon the principle of complete submission, is the summum bonum. This is realized only by the causeless mercy of the Lord, as conditioned souls are naturally disinclined to unconditional submission to another's personality. This was also the stumbling block in the way of the scholars of Nabadwa. They did not believe in the personality of the Lord. But unless the Lord is a person, how is it possible to serve him at all? The Lord, of course, is not a person like conditioned souls. The empiric idea of personality is that of a limited and erring mind joined to a gross physical body. It is not, therefore, at all surprising that there should be a sincere and universal repugnance on the part of empiric thinkers to admit such personality in the case of the Supreme Lord. But the personality of the Lord and of his servants are neither material nor mental. Therefore the objection does not apply. The goddess of learning did not also direct the conqueror to submit to an abstract principle, which would be a fraud. The so-called submission to an abstract principle is rendered to a variable concoction of one's own erring mind. When we pretend to submit to an abstract divinity, We thereby only make a show of submitting to our own pedantic fantasies. As a matter of fact, we are disinclined to submit to a real person, as such submission appears to us to be incompatible with a free rational individual existence. So submission to the Supreme Person is equivalent neither to submission to an abstraction nor to a conditioned soul. The personality of the Supreme Lord is such that by submitting to him we are delivered from the necessity of following the indeterminate abstract concoctions of our own sensuous minds and the similar fancies of others. We have in this world no choice but to submit to one of these two alternatives, and we choose to call the process by the epithets of liberty and rationalism, against the elementary principles of our own logic. Actual unconditional submission to the transcendental personality of the Supreme Lord is the only cure of this misfortune to which we are thus necessarily subject in the conditioned state. Keshav admitted that the personality of the Lord is inconceivable to the empiric reason and is the truth of all the scriptures. Those empiric philosophical systems which try to establish the nature of Godhead by the process of inductive reasoning based on the experience of this world can really arrive at no definite conclusion. Keshav realized that he had known nothing by his so-called erudition, and that it was not possible for him to know the truth except by the mercy of the Lord. He also realized that he was now enabled to understand, against the conclusions of all empiric philosophy, that the son of Sri Jagannath Misra is the Supreme Lord, that his own past profession of submission to the Supreme Lord had been a terrible self-deception, that it was only now that he was privileged to obtain the chance of really submitting to the Supreme Lord himself in the person of Sri Gaur-Sundar, that such submission was at once the cause and the result, the indispensable concomitant, of spiritual enlightenment by the grace of the Lord. The episode of the defeat and conversion of the conqueror is the first recorded instance of the deliverance of a conditioned soul by the mercy of Sri Gaur-Sundar. We would, therefore, be well advised if we try to consider carefully how this mercy was obtained. The process has been described above in detail by the grace of Thakur Brindavandas. We have seen that the mercy of the Lord was not earned by any worldly merit. It was altogether causeless. We can, therefore, obtain some sort of the idea of its nature by the careful consideration of this actual instance. Does such knowledge help us in any way in attaining the spiritual life? It does so negatively, by destroying current misconceptions on the subject. If we give the narrative an impartial hearing and thus prepare our minds for receiving the truth when he actually makes his appearance in the person of the devotee of the Supreme Lord, who teaches us the truth by his own conduct, we can, however, understand the words of the bona fide devotee by the method of personal submission to him. Sri Gaur-Sundar is the Supreme Lord himself. He appeared in this world in the character of his devotee in order to establish the necessity of submission to the servant of the Lord if one really wants to obtain spiritual enlightenment. The episode of the conqueror of all quarters will have, therefore, served its real purpose if it establishes to one's satisfaction the necessity of this procedure to be followed even by those who are supposed to be masters of all the knowledge of this world. But how is it possible to recognize the transcendental personality of the devotees of the Lord? This, of course, depends entirely on the mercy of the Lord himself, which can be secured by serving the goddess of learning not with the object of gaining any worldly advantage but for the purpose of receiving spiritual enlightenment. In the case of the conqueror, he had all along been using his learning to procure reputation and wealth. He was now disillusioned by the causeless mercy of Sri Gaur-Sundar. The devotees of the Lord are ever engaged in endeavoring to reclaim all conditioned souls from the state of bondage to the limiting energy. The bondage is devised by the punitive power of the Lord, who is the negative aspect of his beneficent power. The devotees of the Lord are the agents of positive beneficence of divine power, appearing in this world to deliver all bound souls by affording them an opportunity of actual submission to the agents of the Lord, i.e., to themselves. The bound jiva is seldom inclined to submit to any person other than himself. The inclination to submit to a devotee may be produced by attending carefully to the narrative of the activities of Sri Gaur-Sundar as interpreted by his associates and followers for the benefit of all conditioned souls. It was only after he had submitted to the feet of the Lord that the conqueror attained the spiritual life. He became a devotee of the Lord. The conqueror of all quarters was freed from his accumulated ignorance and at last became really learned by learning the service of the Lord. Keshav Bhatta belonged originally to the school of Nimbarkakriya and is the author of Kramadipika, in which work he lays down the principles of the service of Sri Radhakrishna in conformity with the teachings of Sri Gaur-Sundar and the verses of the Dasa Sayaki of Nimbarkakriya. He was followed by Gangalya Bhatta and other disciples. At a subsequent period, Keshab Kashmiri, who is not to be confounded with Keshab Bhatta, and others gave up the path of Sri Gaur Sundar and established an independent school. But Sri Sanatana Goswami and Sri Gopala Bhatta Goswami, in recognition of the fact that Keshab Bhatta was enlightened by Sri Gaur Sundar, have collected material for the Vaishnavite canon from his work, the Kramadipika referred to above. As the result of the mercy of Sri Gaur Sundar, Keshab Bhatta was enabled, by the operation of the spiritual power of the divinity, to be simultaneously endowed with all excellences in the shape of devotion to the Lord, realization of the divine nature, and aversion to anything other than the Lord. Keshab Bhatta now became humbler than a blade of grass, discarding for good all the vanities of the conqueror of all quarters. The followers of Sri Gaur Sundar adopt the conduct that is prescribed by the scriptures for the truly enlightened, viz. The genuine Brahmanas. They give up all military, economic, or other worldly ambitions and, in fact, all hankering for fame and honor, accepting thereby in their hearts the ideal of the Tridandi Bhikshu. This conduct should not also be misunderstood. The achievements of this world also appear in their true perspective to one only after he realizes his own spiritual nature. They cease to have any direct attraction for such a person who gets disentangled from the progress or decay of material civilization. He is freed from the influence of the hopes and fears of this world, but he is constantly engaged in serving the Lord by means of those very entities on the transcendental plane. The attitude is everything and is spiritual. The external conduct of the devotee is not properly intelligible to worldly people, as it is not directed to any worldly object for any purpose that is intelligible to worldly people. The conduct of the devotee, however, is neither sentimental nor visionary, but part and parcel of the eternal reality himself. Those who imagine the pursuit of sensuous enjoyment to be the sole object of life naturally regard the dedication of learning, health, wealth, and other qualifications for the augmentation of such enjoyment as their legitimate and successful use. But the insignificance and ephemeral character of the result achieved is clearly demonstrated by the phenomenon of death. Death snatches its victim from the scene of his enjoyment and shifts him to an unknown and unknowable destination. As soon as one is enlightened in regard to the real nature of his self, he is enabled to realize the triviality of his so-called happiness and possessions of this world. Such a person is privileged to understand the unwholesomeness of all worldly knowledge and activities as a help for such enjoyment. One is enabled to realize the self and his proper relationship with the ephemeral objects of this world by the mercy of the Supreme Lord. On the appearance of self-knowledge, one automatically understands the nature of the transcendental service of the Lord as being the only proper function of the soul. From this moment he is enabled to be constantly engaged in such service and to dedicate his learning, health and wealth and every other qualification to this purpose. It is not the duty of the soul either to be addicted to the things of this world or to renounce them altogether, as both courses lead nowhere. The duty of the soul is to try and find out the everlasting plane and to learn to function on that plane by giving up the fleeting prospects of the Epicurean and Stoic alike. Such course is the only one that exactly suits the requirements of the soul. The soul can be satisfied with nothing less than the immutable reality. The fact which the soul in the state of bondage does not realize is that the immutable reality is not to be found by the pursuit of fleeting worldly enjoyment, nor by simply abstaining from such pursuits. There is a third and the real method, viz. That of service of Godhead. The nature of this service has to be learned from those who are themselves well established on the spiritual plane. It can be learned by all persons who are sincerely desirous of knowing it and are prepared to give a really patient hearing to the exposition of methods and duties constituting the mode of endeavor for such enlightenment. This attitude is not possible in one who is not convinced of the unsatisfactory character of the correlated methods of enjoyment and renunciation of the things of this world that are consciously or unconsciously followed by all conditioned souls, including the pseudo-religionists. Only one who is thoroughly sincere will be disposed to accept the method that is laid down in the spiritual scriptures and all that such a method necessarily implies. When the spiritual plane is actually attained, one is in a position to realize for himself, in a clear and conscious manner, the true nature of the cosmic and supercosmic processes and his own place and function in the whole scheme of the universe. The realization of this should be possible in this life if one is prepared loyally to undergo the necessary training. It cannot, of course, be equally easy of attainment for all. There are very few persons who are fully prepared to accept the truth on his own terms. On those who are really so prepared, the communication of the truth acts with wonderful suddenness, because they really offer no resistance to his entry into their hearts. But most of us are not really prepared to welcome the truth even when we profess to cherish him. This is the condition of the average honest person of this world. It is claimed in these pages that such persons are sure to benefit by listening patiently to the exposition of the career of Sri Gaur Sundar from the lips of the real devotee. They will thereby gradually acquire the effective desire for living up to the truth. No worldly merit or demerit can either help or retard the process of spiritual enlightenment. It is situated wholly beyond the range of every form of worldly conviction and is, indeed, likely to be more easily grasped by those who are less under the sway of their formed convictions. Those who have absolute faith in worldliness and perpetual ignorance are enamored of the deeds of the heroes of this world. But we have also the testimony of all teachers of the religion to the utter hollowness of all worldly achievements. A child may oppose the reconstruction of a house that is uninhabitable on the ground that the masons are plotting its destruction. But he is nevertheless necessarily wrong. Our worldly life requires to be thoroughly overhauled and reconstructed on a sounder basis. Those who are unduly attached to the rotten house by reason of either ignorance or malice need not be regarded as wise. Empiricists are engaged in the attempt of trying to live safely and comfortably in the badly built falling house by opposing the process of imperative reconstruction. They do so partly for the avowed reason that it will be impossible to retain any measure of rottenness in the edifice after it has been thoroughly overhauled. They are right, no doubt, but they are less alive to the consequences of their perversity. The policy is sure to bring the whole house down and crush them to death. There is absolutely no chance of their being able to live safely and comfortably in the rotten structure at any time. The deceptive triumphs of material civilization have failed to solve the old problem of the uncivilized times, why everything of this world is foredoomed to pass away. Those savages were not content with the conditions of their existence any more than we are with ours, and also mainly for similar reasons. If an enchantress is pleased to provide us with an endless stock of the most beautiful things that make their appearance only to pass away, should we suppose that our requirement has been really fulfilled? It is no less necessary for us than it ever was for those savages to pause and consider well whether the achievements and convictions of material prosperity have any real value in the scale of our absolute requirements. The quest of the truth is not for those who are content to remain ignorant by the lure of the dissipating enjoyment of the moment. The defect is not one of intellect, it extends to all the faculties which also have their due share in the performance of conscious activity. The self-imposed sway of empiric knowledge, which supplies no definite answer to our fundamental questionings, is responsible for all the misfortune of humanity. Empiric knowledge does not take man an inch towards the truth. On the contrary, it leads its votaries by an accelerated pace towards sin and death by its justification of the false ideal of a life of dissipation alternating with that of barren asceticism, the twin forms of egotistic worldliness. It ever whispers into the ears of men that in this present depraved condition he seems also to like so much that he need not depend on nor submit to any other authority than his own, that he is the master of his body and mind and through them of all things of this world which, he is assured, have been intended solely for ministering to his corrupt pleasures. These conflicting ideals of empiric knowledge require to be smashed as the first step in any plan for rescuing fallen humanity from the fell clutches of the enchantress. This was being done by Sri Gaur Sundar during the period of his professor life at Nabadwip and also in the subsequent period when he traveled for this sole purpose all over the country as a sannyasin. Those who suppose that it is against principle of humility to oppose the untruth or neglect to vindicate the truth are the emissaries of the deluding power. The attitude of humility is to be practiced by all means because we cannot know the truth by our own unaided effort. Empiric knowledge errs by ignoring this basic principle of spiritual conduct. By submitting to empiric knowledge, not humility but insolence in its undiluted form is practiced. Those who are loyal servants of the truth are necessarily opposed to empiricism, which is verily the embodiment of insolent denial of the supremacy of the truth. Worldly people practice this masked insolence under the name of humility for deceiving themselves as well as their victims. But it should be easy to distinguish between true humility and the counterfeit, where the uncompromising assertion of the principle of real humility is to be found in the resolve not to tolerate any of those countless insincere shifts devised by suicidal worldliness under the connivance of empiric knowledge for ruining humanity by masking them in the borrowed phraseology of godliness. This was admitted by the conqueror of all quarters. He was satisfied by being defeated in controversy by the Lord himself. This extraordinary result would not have been produced if he had been worsted by an ordinary mortal. The process of controversy itself would have been a quite different one. The conqueror realized that his untruth had been confronted by truth and was, therefore, utterly powerless to assert itself. He felt that he had been dabbling with words which might please and amuse but were really mere empty sounds signifying nothing. This utter hollowness of all so-called worldly knowledge is demonstrated to all sincere persons by truth himself in the form of the words of the devotees of truth. On the lips of one who really serves the Absolute, it is the Absolute Truth himself who makes his appearance in the form of the divine transcendental sound. Divinity as sound has power to convey the knowledge of himself to a soul who is prepared to receive him as sound against every specious obstructive argument. The arrogance of the devotee of the Lord is thus the perfection of true humility. Those who realize this are freed from the fetters of the deluding energy inasmuch as they are thereby proved to have no interest of their own as against the truth. Those who can be angry with the follower of truth under any circumstance are necessarily under the spell of empiric untruth, which always differentiates the external conduct and the internal motives. But a votary of truth is always necessarily above duplicity of this kind. This is realizable only by those who are themselves also wholly sincere. Impertinent fears for the future of the world never disturb the devotee of the Lord nor deflect him from the constant service of the truth. This detachment should not be confounded with idleness or indifference to duty. The alertness and industry of the worldling neither help nor retard the march of events of this world, which is wholly controlled by a very much superior power called in our Shastras Maya, or the limiting potency of Godhead acting in perfect obedience to the will of the Supreme Lord. The empiricist, in his childish atheistical folly, chooses to imagine, against the clear impartial testimony of his own rational faculty, that he is the creator and controller of the forces of nature. On the basis of this sacrilegious folly he builds up a science of conduct in keeping with this basic principle. It is the business of the devotee to strike at the very root of this folly in order to demolish the flimsy structure which has power to draw to itself so unaccountably the whole attention of most people of this world. There is no rational ground for doubting that a structure which is built on truth is sure to prove a more suitable arrangement than one which is reared on untruth backed by insincerity. It is a fatal delusion, indeed, which has led rational beings to the strange conviction that they can manage to live well without truth, and that it is, therefore, their duty to oppose the truth on the plea of possible damage to the existing systems of untruth. The devotee is sent into this world by the Lord in order to establish spiritual conduct by demonstrating the instability of the worldly life, its prospects and achievements. It is never possible nor rationally desirable to try to build our lasting home in this world. They are mistaken who suppose that this life has to be lived for its own sake. Such people are sure to be surprised by death in the midst of their preparations for settling down in right earnest. This life is a preparation for the eternal life and should be lived accordingly. That conduct is fatal which in any way obstructs or delays the process of spiritual enlightenment. We should not allow ourselves to be diverted from the true purpose of this life by the temptations and disappointments provided by the deluding energy of the Lord, which are intended to help the process of our spiritual training if only they are rightly understood. Chapter 6, Thakur Haridas. Before his meeting with Sri Gaur Sundar, it will not be out of place at this stage to introduce the great personality who is the practicing teacher, Akriya, of the chanting of the holy name, the special divine dispensation for the age of discord, Kali Yuga, the establishment of which is one of the purposes of the appearance of Sri Gaur Sundar in this world. Thakur Haridas is the eternal associate of the Supreme Lord and appears in the company of the Lord whenever and wherever the Lord himself chooses to make his appearance. Thakur Haridas plays a different role in the different avatars of the Lord. In this avatara he is the Akriya of the holy name. The holy name is both the method and object of worship of every pure soul. In the Kali age nothing less than the name himself can effect the deliverance of fettered souls. This teaching of Sri Gaur Sundar is exemplified by the life of Thakur Haridas. In order, therefore, to be able to understand the method and object of worship that can alone be acceptable to a highly controversial age like the present, which is least disposed to take anything on trust, it will be necessary to follow attentively the events of the life of the Akriya. The fashionable theology at Nabadwip, which was the cultural center of Bengal at the time of the appearance of the Lord, was frankly atheistical. The philosophical school of the New Logic, Nabhanaya, may be described as the attempt of our empiric reason to deny the necessity, as well as practicability of all worship. The jiva is himself discovered to be both worshipper and worshipped. Worship itself is supposed to be but a concoction of the jiva's own erroneous speculations. The position to which one of the most highly developed system of the philosophy of logic led the people of Nabadwip at the time of the appearance of the Lord, and through them was accepted by people all over the country, was exactly what was specifically the worst fitted for understanding the uncompromising pure form of worship which it was the will of the Lord to propagate by the life of Thakur Haridas. Whatever name might be borne by the different system of speculative philosophy, they are in common agreement as regards the logical necessity of atheism. Even the Gita and the Bhagavatam were taught at Nabadwip at this period as scriptures of atheism. It gives us an idea of the audacity and range of activity of the new school of logic of Nabadwip, that it could devise interpretations even of the unambiguous texts of the Bhagavatam itself in favor of their theory of Rankast atheism. It is only to be expected in these circumstances that the scholarship and acumen of Bengal should be generously recognized in all parts of the country and abroad, and even by the atheistical Vedantists of Benares, who have always claimed for themselves the theological leadership of philosophical atheism in India. Thakur Haridas made his appearance in the village of Budhan in the district of Jessore in East Bengal. This has made that part of the country since then a center of the worship of Godhead by means of the Kirtan. Thakur Haridas was born in a Mohammedan family. He comes into the light of our definite narrative under his changed name of Haridas, which means literally the servant of Hari, Hari being the name of Godhead in the scriptures. So Haridas must have given up his family and society in some manner that is not definitely known to us, had been the recipient of the mercy of a Vaishnava, and had already made extraordinary progress on the path of pure devotion, although he was in the first flush of youth when he is found living as a recluse in the forest of Benapole in his native district of Jessore. In the depth of the forest he resided in a solitary hut, worshipped the holy Tulasi, chanted daily the holy name 3,300,000 of times night and day, and ate food cooked in the homes of Brahmanas, which he obtained by begging. The Hindu chief, who was in charge of the local administration of that part of the country, bore the name of Ramachandra Khan. He was one of the greatest of atheists and a hater of the servants of Vishnu, lit the one all-pervading Lord. Haridas was treated with great reverence by the people. Ramachandra Khan found this intolerable. He could not rest till he had actually devised a plan for effecting the humiliation of Thakur Haridas. For this purpose he did not hesitate to stoop to be basest of devices. Ramachandra Khan, finding that Haridas was reputed to be absolutely free from all vices, hit upon a plan of creating in him the vice by exposing which he hoped to accomplish his ruin. He summoned to his help the most famous harlots and told them to destroy the chastity of Haridas, who was under the vow of continence as an ascetic. One of the harlots, who was young and possessed great beauty, undertook to effect his ruin in course of 3 days. Ramachandra Khan pressed her to take an armed footman, Paik, who was to catch him red-handed and bring both of them for punishment. But the harlot proposed that she should at first go by herself, and after being with Haridas once take the Paik to capture him on her second visit. That harlot, having put on her best attire, then presented herself at nightfall at the solitary cell of Thakur Haridas. After making her obeisance to the Tulasi, she went up to the entrance of the cell and bowing to the Thakur remained there standing. She then sat down at the doorstep, exposing her body to the view of Haridas, and made confession of her uncontrollable passion for him, praying to be favored by his intimate society. Thakur Haridas agreed to fulfill her wish after he had finished chanting the due number of the name, bidding her in the meantime to wait and listen to the Sankirtana of the name chanted by himself. The harlot on this assurance remained seated there as Haridas went on with his loud chant of the holy name till break of day. The harlot came away disappointed when it was morning, and informed Ramachandra Khan that Haridas had promised to enjoy her society and that the promise would be carried out when she met him next night. As the harlot presented herself before Thakur Haridas on the second evening, he expressed his request that as on the previous occasion he could not keep his promise to her for the reason that he could not complete the chant of the due number of the name, he would certainly fulfill her desire after the chanting of the due number of the name had been completed, and he accordingly bade her wait there and listen to the chanting of the name. The harlot made obeisance to the Tulasi and the Thakur and sat listening to the chanting of the holy name. But she naturally grew restive as the night was drawing to a close. The Thakur, noticing her impatience, told her that he had taken the vow of chanting a crore of the name in course of the month. He had expected to finish the full number that night but could not do so although he had chanted him the whole night. The number would be certainly completed by the next night and then the vow would be fulfilled and he would be in the position to enjoy her company. The harlot reported accordingly to Ramachandra Khan. On the third evening the harlot duly made her appearance and, after making obeisance to the Tulasi and the Thakur, sat at the entrance of the cell listening to the chanting of the holy name, chanting the same herself, till the close of that night. The mind of the harlot was changed by chanting the holy name all night in the company of Thakur Haridas. She now fell prostrate at the feet of Thakur Haridas and confessed to him everything regarding the plot of Ramachandra Khan. She said she had committed endless sin as she was a harlot by trade. She begged the Thakur to save her, who was so vile, by his mercy. Haridas Thakur replied that he knew everything about the Khan and would have left the place 3 days ago. He had delayed his departure by 3 days on her account. The harlot then prayed that he might mercifully instruct her as to how she was to get rid of the miseries of the worldly life. Thakur Haridas then tendered her this advice: give away everything of your household to the Brahmanas. Come and stay here in this cell, chant constantly the holy name. Worship the Tulasi. You will then obtain the feet of Krishna in no time. After saying this and instructing her in the holy name, the Thakur rose up and left the place, chanting the name of Hari. Then that harlot, on obtaining the command of the Guru, gave away to the Brahmanas all the wealth that she had. With shaven head and a single piece of cloth for wrapping her body, she lived in that cell and took the holy name 3 lakhs of times in course of every night and day. She worshipped the Tulasi, ate uncooked food by chewing, and often fasted. The senses were controlled and love of God had manifested itself. She became a famous devotee and a great spiritual teacher, and Vaishnavas of the highest order often came thither to have a sight of her. The people were astonished by this wonderful behavior of the quondam harlot and bowed with reverence whenever they spoke of the greatness of Haridas. As the above theme is the subject of the highest importance to the present age, I have tried to keep scrupulously to the words of Sri Kavira Goswami in describing this famous event of the life of Thakur Haridas. The chanting of the holy name of Krishna imparted by a pure devotee rescued a youthful harlot who had tried to seduce the saint at the instigation of a most profligate atheist. By this process the harlot was not merely rescued from a life of shame but became a devotee of the Lord fit to lift others to the plane of perfect purity. The chanting of the holy name can, therefore, reclaim the worst of sinners. The holy name has to be heard with reverence from the lips of a pure devotee. The holy name has to be received as a sacrament from a pure devotee by complete submission at his feet. The holy name so received has to be constantly chanted by being free from all offense. The Tulasi has to be worshipped. All earthly possessions and all association with worldly people, especially in matters of food, clothing and residence, must be disowned. By this method, in a short time, the highest spiritual state is realizable. That state consists in serving exclusively the feet of Krishna. This is the special divine dispensation for this age of discord announced by the spiritual scriptures and promulgated by the Supreme Lord, Sri Krishna Chaitanya, through his eternal servant, Thakur Haridas. The obvious objection to the above that is likely to suggest itself to those who are too much addicted to the concerns of this world is that it does not sufficiently appeal to the rationalistic imagination. The scheme seems to be dry and sterile. It also appears to be both meaningless and impracticable. Every admittedly futile speculation, despite its futility, seems to be more worthy of the serious consideration of the worldling than any transcendental proposition. Appearances are decidedly against the acceptance of the teaching of Thakur Haridas by the average merely intellectual worldling. In the first place, Thakur Haridas seems to ignore wholly the life that is ordinarily led by people all over the world. The new life that is proposed has apparently no point of contact with the life previously led by the disciple after election. This is not likely to appeal to those to whom the theory of materialistic evolution has become as it were the very breath of their nostrils. Is a real gap or abrupt revolution possible in the world of life? Can there be any such thing as the absence of proper purpose anywhere on the part of anybody in this fair world? Such and similar questions are bound to rush into the brain of all mental speculationists the moment they are asked to take the holy name of Krishna to the exclusion of every worldly function. The proposal seems to be so puerile and so queer and so utterly destructive of all that is near and dear to the heart of the average man. It is for this reason that the sadhus are on principle opposed to discuss spiritual subjects with persons who do not really seek the truth. Those who think that for them there is no driving necessity for such quest are not likely to follow seriously any elucidation of propositions that have nothing to do with anything in which they feel really interested. The complete denial of any place to empiric conclusions in the life that is proposed for the novice is a staggering blow to most people who feel instinctively that they should refuse to listen to what obviously amounts to nothing short of an incitement to the commission of suicide. The spiritual purpose itself cannot, however, be explained away nor whittled down by means of clever interpretations. The actual doings and saying of Thakur Haridas stand in the way of those who try to do so. The Thakur literally acted as he taught. He acted also in accordance with the plainest meaning of his words, so there can be no ambiguity whatsoever. The harlot's condition was not essentially different from that of any other worldling. The irrepressible desire for complete renunciation of the world is the natural and inevitable result of the appearance of any real inclination for the spiritual life. The awakened worldly mind understands the necessity of committing mundane suicide in order to be reborn as the immaculate soul for the purpose of realizing the life eternal. The material mind is not a figment of the empiric imagination. It is a real envelope and has to be completely discarded. It will not do to imagine this enveloping darkness as possessing anything in common with the light. The material mind is like a sheet of impenetrable darkness that completely shuts out the light of the soul. The soul is by his nature self-refulgent and has nothing to do with the material mind, which acts as a screen to cut off the light of the soul from the view of the observer who uses the mind for such purpose. This is fact and not a hypothesis like the so-called truths and facts conceived by the material mind in the vanity of its ignorance. The spiritual realization of the categorical difference and relation of utter incompatibility between mind and soul is the first unique experience on the threshold of the awakened spiritual life. The harlot was not converted by speculative arguments addressed to the mind but simply by listening to the name of Hari from the lips of Thakur Haridas and chanting the same herself in his company. She had apparently the advantage of possessing at the very outset a natural regard for Thakur Haridas and for his advice and also for the holy Tulasi. This was the only antecedent condition of her redemption. Was it, therefore, blind and traditional faith that actually saved her in this crisis? The answer must be in the negative. Those who are most officiously given to the cult of blind faith are not necessarily attracted towards the actual devotee. The affinity for the true soul is itself a spiritual, that is to say perfectly self-conscious, impulse. It must be most carefully distinguished from the blind, material impulse which is so common and which, as a matter of fact, is the worst form of obstacle in the way of the realization of the spiritual life. The instinctive affinity of the harlot for Haridas is an activity of the soul and as such is, therefore, perfectly moral, perfectly self-cognizant and categorically different from sensuous sentimentality that ordinarily passes in this world as blind faith. Faith is the instinctive attitude of the soul towards the truth and can, therefore, never be blind. It is the blind who in their blindness confound true faith with the counterfeit wherewith which alone they happen to be, unfortunately for themselves, only too familiar. Real faith can alone lead one to the presence of the pure soul. The material mind cannot reach the proximity of a sadhu. The harlot possessed the spiritual faculty by which it was possible for her to really approach Thakur Haridas. The Shastras say that this true instinctive reverence for sadhus is the result of previous unconscious association with the pure devotees of the Lord. For the proper unconscious association with sadhu also sensuous sentimentality is often the chief hindrance. The sensuous sentimentalist seeks the gratification of his own senses. He, therefore, is least disposed to serve the sadhu on the account of the latter. It is going against his grain. The sadhus accordingly keep away from philanthropists as these are not willing to learn to get rid of their sentimentality. A pseudo-devotee, who parades his false sentimentality, readily enough obtains the cheap reverence of all worldly persons as his due, by misunderstanding of the purpose of the scriptures. Such a person is not likely to bow to the sadhu, as he really wants to be served himself. Plain worldly people are likely to be more easily benefited by the process of unconscious association with the sadhus. Those who bring with them any previously formed notions regarding the nature of the sadhus find it difficult to get rid of those false sentiments which stand in the way of their associating on a proper footing with the real sadhus. The only natural way of associating with the devotees of Godhead consists in doing whatever the sadhu wants one to do and in the way that he advises, without expecting any desirable or undesirable result to oneself therefrom. The harlot possessed something like this natural faith in sadhus by reason of her previous unconscious association with the devotees of Godhead. The immoral life that was being actually led by the harlot did not stand in the way of her redemption. The point is made absolutely clear by the fact that she went to Thakur Haridas for the purpose of seducing him. This shows also that her instinctive faith in sadhus was not colored by any conventional moral sentiments. This was an advantage. Too rigid empiric morality obstructs spiritual awakening more effectively than even confirmed immorality. This is due to want of humility and spirit of submission to the sadhu that is sure to be engendered more or less by the dogmatic professor of conventional morality. True morality is never possible prior to spiritual awakening. That which passes as morality in the society of worldlings is only a hypocritical and, therefore, more dangerous form of immorality. The moral instinct proper, which belongs to the soul, must not be confounded with this hypocritical immorality and its conventions. The harlot was not hampered by the conventions of a hypocritical morality. She possessed an open mind with a natural liking for the society of really pure souls, although she herself was actually leading a life that is condemned by moralists. But as it is not possible for a person to be really and fully moral before he realizes the nature of his true self, the case of the harlot, instead of being worse, was in certain respects better than that of the conventional moralist who is rigidly committed to the casuistical defense of the unspiritual life that he actually leads. It is not, of course, intended to undervalue the principle of morality in any way. That instinct, in its pure form, as in the case of every other instinct, belongs to the soul. The form, in which it passes current in the world, is only the perverted reflection of the real principle and is not conducive to spiritual life. Its apparent advantages are strictly confined to this perverted existence. Whatever tends to reconcile us to the worldly life, stands self-condemned for that very reason. Empiric morality is fully open to this charge of pandering to the unspiritual life. As a matter of fact, neither conventional morality nor conventional immorality are praised by the sadhus, as, by themselves, they stand without any relation to the truth. As soon as our conduct gets related to the truth, it assumes its natural state, which has nothing to do with either the conventional moral or immoral principle of this world. To call the spiritual conduct as merely moral in the ordinary conventional sense of the world would, therefore, be wholly misleading. The spiritual conduct is no doubt perfectly wholesome, being free from all affinity with the unwholesome things of this world. The so-called moral conduct based on worldly experience owes all its value to its worldly utility. This fact categorically differentiates spiritual purity from worldly morality. There is, of course, no possibility of immoral conduct on the spiritual plane. In the absence of all possibility of immorality, there is no scope for worldly morality in the realm of the absolute. The kingdom of Godhead accommodates all varieties of conduct by endowing all of them with perfect wholesomeness. Can such conduct be appropriately called moral in the conventional sense of the term? For instance, the trade of the harlot is in this world generally held to be utterly immoral. Is it possible for the ethical mind to conceive of a state of existence that is infinitely higher than any conceivable worldly moral excellence? Those fanatics who, grossly misunderstanding the nature of the subject treated by the spiritual scriptures, set up as orthodox and uncompromising believers in the letter of the scriptural texts and try to reform the abuses of this world by immoral regulations that are profoundly attributed to Godhead himself on the strength of such silly and mischievous interpretation, deserve to be put into the pound in the company of those innocent creatures that are mercifully denied the quality of voicing their notions for harming everybody. There are hypocritical pedants who affect to hold up their nose at the very sound of the name of a harlot and forthwith prescribe penitential punishment of the most atrocious kind for reforming their morals in obedience to the injunctions of the Holy Scriptures. The devil is also permitted to quote the Scriptures for his purposes. Fanatics and hypocrites were in possession of the stage of the tragic drama of worldly life at the time when Thakur Haridas emerged on the bewildered vision of those pseudo-religionists and began to supply by his actual conduct the real explanation of the only purpose of all the scriptures, by electing the harlot as the fittest and the very first object of the divine grace. He was naturally opposed by the renegade Brahmana Ramachandra Khan who, in order to exploit the letter of the scriptures for the accomplishment of his villainy, gave it out as his duty to put down by all means a Mohammedan who had the temerity to set up as the expounder of the Shastras of the Hindus. This brings us to the principle of hereditary caste. The teaching of the Shastras belongs exclusively to the twice-born. The Shastras themselves lay down elaborate rules by which to constitute the community of the Brahmanas who are to be the only teachers of them. This last part of the system had been allowed to pass out of the memory of the people and, in its place, had been substituted by gradual and insidious steps and by general connivance, the principle of heredity. The hereditary Brahmanas by the strict Shastric test are no Brahmanas at all. Ramachandra Khan was the champion of this corrupt system, not for any real regard born of sincere conviction for the merits of the system itself or from any knowledge of the Shastras, but, as it always happens in such cases, from malice and insolence. If Haridas Thakur would practice the function strictly reserved for hereditary Brahmanas, then the whole system of caste based upon the principle of heredity is challenged at its source. If a Mohammedan can become a Brahmana, the present social system of the Hindus, which is claimed to be part and parcel of the religion, is utterly demolished. This was bound to agitate profoundly all caste Hindus. Nor was this all. The chanting of the holy name of Krsna was also practiced with a loud voice. This was an entirely novel mode of worship to the Hindus of that time. The new outcast apostle of the eternal religion, in opposition to all current rituals and forms of worship, was declaring to admiring Hindus an apparently new form of worship as the one enjoined by the Shastras. Could all the contemporaneous Hindus be so utterly mistaken that they required to be imparted ab initio the knowledge of the fundamentals of their own religion by a Mohammedan, against the teaching of all the hereditary Brahmanas, the exclusive teachers of the same by the rules of the Shastras themselves? It is quite easy to imagine the intense consternation and hostility that were naturally aroused in an age of casuistical fanaticism by the preaching of the simple doctrines of the religion of the truth. The chanting of the holy name of Godhead is the only sacrament of the true religion prescribed for the present age. This simplification is in keeping with the spirit of all the other sacraments authorized by the Shastras. The other sacraments are not suitable for this age, which is too much addicted to skeptical argumentation ad nauseam. As soon as one realizes the true nature of the soul, all his activities are thenceforward naturally and necessarily performed on the spiritual plane. The narrow ceremonial view of the sacrament is due to the imperfect spiritual vision of the observer. The sacrament may, therefore, differ in the different ages in its external appearance, which is, however, the only view that is open to the notice for whose special benefit it is ordained. The chanting of the holy name is liable to the least objection even as sacrament, from a casuistical age. The mercy of Godhead must be sought willingly, nay with the keenest hankering that is born of positive liking for obtaining real touch with Him in order to serve Him by means of the spiritual senses of the pure soul. The sacrament implies a real mutual personal relationship between the Lord and His servant. It is definite, concrete and loving, but in the spiritual, not abstract, notional or concocted, i.e., purely mental, sense. The personality, senses and functions of the soul are not comprehensible to, nor admissible by the mind. The mental refusal to recognize the substantive existence of the soul is the greatest curse of this age of dogmatic empiricism. This piece of dogmatism must be got rid of. The empiric reason is confronted to a fight at its own weapons when it is summoned to admit the rationale of the worship of Godhead by means of His name only. The name of Godhead must not also be supposed to connote or denote anything of this world, in no shape, neither as precept nor concept. This should, in all conscience, more than satisfy the passion for abstraction of even the Muslim iconoclast. The next point is that the name of Godhead must be admitted as true and not as a mere concoction of the material mind. The scriptural name of Godhead is not a thing of this world. The scriptural name is Himself divine. The scriptural name requires to be served with the tongue by an attitude of humble supplication for manifesting His divine nature to the pure serving essence of our soul. Even the most rabid iconoclast need have no cause of complaint against such service. It is this pure service that was practiced by Thakur Haridas, which, he maintained, was the only sacrament enjoined by the scriptures as suitable for this age of wrangling sophistry, Kali Yuga. The implications of this position will be more fully developed in course of this narrative at the proper stages. As the service of Godhead is the eternal function of the individual soul in the state of grace, it transcends all mental and physical activities. The Shastras accordingly reserve the service of Godhead to those who are twice born. The terms Brahmana, one who has knowledge of Godhead as the great, and Dvaya, twice born, applied to persons who are eligible for the service of Godhead, refer to the individual soul in the state of grace and not to caste. If Thakar Haridas be regarded as a Muslim born, it is then the physical body that is denoted by the name Thakar Haridas. If Ramachandra Khan claimed to be a Brahmana on the strength of his seminal birth in a Brahmana family, he also supposed his physical body to be Brahmana. The objection of Ramachandra Khan to Thakar Haridas on the strength of such foolish interpretation of the Shastras was met by Thakar Haridas by pity and indifference. Ramachandra Khan did not possess the good fortune of the harlot, whom he made the dupe of his deviltries, to be enabled to listen to the holy name of Godhead from the lips of Thakar Haridas. A Brahmana, who claims to be such by right of seminal birth, is less fit for spiritual service than even an open-minded harlot. From Fulia Thakar Haridas moved off to Chandpur. The village of Chandpur was situated in the present district of Hugli in the neighborhood of Tribini, Saptagram Tribini. Balaram and Jadunandanacharyas, the Purohits, family priests of Hiranya and Gobardhan Mazumdars of Tribini, had their residence in the village of Chandpur, which lay to the east of Tribini. The word Mazumdar is the equivalent of Majumadar, the title of an accountant of the royal revenues under the Nawabs. Balaramacharya was the disciple of Thakar Haridas and regarded himself as his servant. Haridas stayed with Balaramacharya in the latter's house. Balaramacharya with great care made arrangements for the residence of the Thakar in the village. Haridas lived there in a hut and accepted the alms of food at the house of Balaramacharya. The boy Raghunath Das, son of Gobardhan, was at this time studying under Balaramacharya. Raghunath used to go to Thakar Haridas for a sight of the saint. Haridas was merciful to the boy. Thakar Haridas's mercy was the cause of the subsequent attainment of spiritual enlightenment by Raghunath Das. The following event occurred while Thakar Haridas was staying at Chandpur. One day Balaramacharya, by his humble supplications, induced Thakar Haridas to repair to a gathering at the house of the Mazumdars. The two brothers stood up on seeing the Thakar and, falling at his feet, offered him a seat with great respect. There was present in the assembly a very large number of Pandits, Brahmanas, and other worthy people. The two brothers Hiranya and Gobardhana were also very learned persons. All present spoke highly in praise of Thakar Haridas. This met with the hearty approval of the brothers. It was known to all that the Thakar recited the holy name 3 lakhs of times daily. The Pandits accordingly talked about the greatness of the name as Thakar Haridas assumed his seat in their midst. Some of the Pandits said that the cure of all sinfulness automatically results from uttering the name of Godhead. Others expressed the view that the individual soul, Jiva, is freed from the miseries of this life by uttering the name. Haridas declared that those two were not proper fruits of the chanting of the name. Love to the feet of Krishna is aroused by taking of the name. Haridas said that the condition of a person who realizes such love is described in a sloka of the Bhagavatam, Bhagavatam 2:35. A person who is habituated to serve Krishna in the ways enunciated above, viz., hearing, chanting, etc., loses all control over his mind and, by reason of realizing the quality of love by chanting the name of Krishna, experiences an anxious restlessness of the heart. He loses all consideration for the opinion of the people and laughs, cries, shouts, sings and dances at intervals. Salvation and destruction of sinfulness are only attendant results. Just as the rising of the sun dispels all darkness, so also no sooner does the name of Hari manifests himself than he forthwith destroys all the sins of the person who utters his name. Haridas requested the Pandits present to explain the above loka. All the Pandits desired Thakar Haridas to elucidate its meaning to them. Haridas, who had recited the loka, now said that even before the sun actually begins to appear, darkness is dispelled by his approaching light, and the fear from thieves, ghosts and demons is also destroyed. And, on his actual appearance, all useful activities begin to be performed. In like manner, sins and other evils are destroyed by the reflected light of the approaching sunrise of the full manifestation of the name. While, on the actual appearance of the name, love to the feet of Krishna is aroused. Salvation is a trivial result which is effected by the dim reflection cast by the name as his appearance draws nigh. The devotee does not wish to accept salvation which is at first offered by Krishna. Haridas quoted the two following lokas of the Bhagavatam in support of his contention. Bhagavatam 2:42, 5:19-12. If the dying Ajamal could attain to the realm of the Vaikuntha by calling upon Hari, which happened to be the name of his son, who can estimate the effect if the name is chanted with faith? Mayam says Krishna, never accept the different forms of salvation, e.g., attainment of my realm, attainment of power and wealth and fame similar to mine, the privileges of dwelling near me, even the favor of becoming one with myself, all of which privileges I offer them unreservedly. They covet nothing except my service. Gopal Chakravarti was a Brahmana who belonged to the household of the Mazumdars, being employed to carry letters and money to the king. He had to go up to Gauda and appear before the Padishah himself in connection with the discharge of his official duties. He used to convey 12 lakhs of rupees annually to the king. He was, in his early youth, very handsome and a very good scholar. Gopal lost his patience on hearing that salvation can be obtained by the dim reflection of the name. He then spoke in great anger. Pandits who are in assembly here, said Gopal, all of you have heard the conclusion announced by one whose trade is to amuse people by dance and song. Emancipation, which is unattainable by means of knowledge of the Brahman in crores of births, is held by him to follow automatically the manifestation of the dimmest reflection of the name. At this point Haridas entreated Gopal not to entertain any doubt on the subject, as the Shastras themselves declare that liberation from the bondage of the world results at once from the appearance of the dim reflection of the name. The bliss of liberation is utterly trivial in comparison with the happiness of loving service. It is for this reason that the devotees do not accept liberation. The Thakur then quoted the sloka of Hari Bhakti Sudhoda, H.B.H.S. 1431. Teacher of the universe, to me, immersed in the pure ocean of bliss by meeting thee, the bliss of the attainment of the knowledge of the Brahman, the great nourisher, appears to be as contemptible as the tiny speck of water filling a hole in the ground indented by the hoof of cattle. The Brahmana now became furious. He shouted out that he would assuredly cut off his nose if liberation does not result from the dim reflection of the name. On hearing the blasphemy, the members of the assembly gave vent to their sorrow at the behavior of Gopal. Mazumdar reproved him severely. Balaramakriya expressed his indignation by remarking that the offender was a fool fit only for hair-splitting sophistry and was perfectly ignorant of the principle of devotion. How could he go the length of insulting even Thakur Haridas? He was doomed to perdition beyond all help. Haridas rose to leave the place as he heard the words of the Brahmana. Mazumdar forthwith severed all his official connection with Gopal and with all the assembled persons fell prostrate at the feet of Thakur Haridas. Haridas smiled and spoke sweet words. He said none of them had done anything offensive except that the Brahmana was also not to blame. His addiction to controversial discussion was the cause of his strange behavior. The greatness of the name is not realizable by futile discussion. How could he, therefore, understand those principles? He then bade them depart to their homes in peace, expressing the wish that no one might come to grief by his connection with himself. Hiranya Das came back to his house after receiving this assurance of pardon and forbade Gopal to cross his threshold. In course of 3 days the offending Brahmana was attacked with virulent leprosy. His very prominent nose rapidly melted away. The fingers of his hands and feet, rivaling the champaka buds in their delicacy, all shriveled up and dissolved away by the corrosive force of the malady. On beholding this all the people were filled with great wonder. They praised Haridas and made obeisance to him with reverence. Sri Krishna Kavira Goswami concludes the above account with the pregnant observation that although Haridas did not feel offended by the conduct of the Brahmana, yet did Godhead award the offender the punishment due to his transgression. It is the nature of the devotee of Godhead that he ever pardons the faults of the ignorant. It is Krishna's nature that he cannot bear any calumniation of his devotees even through ignorance. Haridas was grieved at heart on hearing of the misery of the Brahmana. He apprised Balaramakriya of his intention to leave the place and proceed to Shantipur. The account is prefaced by Krishnadas Kavira Goswami with the remark that the event narrated is most wonderful for the reason that it contains the clear elucidation, from the lips of the Akriya himself, of the divine dispensation of the present age. The reader must not forget the point which is the center of interest of the whole narrative detailed in this work, viz., that Thakur Haridas is the Akriya or the practicing teacher, authorized by Godhead to promulgate the congregational chanting, Sankirtana, of the holy name, which is the mode of worship that alone can demolish the worst form of atheism in the name of free thinking that is unfortunately so prevalent nowadays all over the world, and which is the terrible but inevitable natural consequence of the exclusive worship of mammon by all the resources of mind and body. The world is gratuitously assumed by a pseudo-rationalism to be the only reality, and the attempt is, therefore, made to ascertain the methods by following which we can attain the gratification of the senses, which function appears to be the relationship naturally subsisting between ourselves and the world. The senses are assumed to be an integral and undetachable part of ourselves. The mind is identified with the senses on the one hand and the soul on the other. The senses connect the mind, or the soul, by this assumption, with the external world. The senses are the eyes of the whole system. All pain and pleasure suffered by the mind are due to the way in which the mind directs the senses in their relations with the world. The mind cannot apparently know by intuition, at any rate ordinarily, all the consequences of any particular mode of employment of the senses. The mind can, indeed, try to guess about them, but it can never be quite sure about any occurrence till after actual experience. This uncertainty is supposed to be reducible to certainty if it could be possible to know from experience the uniform laws that are assumed to govern all phenomenal occurrences under all circumstances. This hypothesis of the uniform operation of the laws of nature has been built up by the accumulated experiences of the race. But as the occurrences themselves present an infinity of complications, it has not been possible to attain to anything like certainty in isolating the single threads of the web in order to be certain of our hypothesis in every case by being enabled to reproduce in the occurrences of nature in the laboratory. Assuming that the above object of scientific endeavor will be realizable in practice in the long run, its success should make it possible for us to prolong the possibility and scope of sensuous enjoyment ad infinitum. If we fail to be perfectly happy by the complete elimination of pain by the proper employment of the forces of nature in the way that is calculated to produce such a result under the then known laws of nature, our labor should still have really no abiding value for ourselves. But has our experience up to the present moment taken us an inch towards the realization of unmixed or lasting pleasure? Is pleasure really different from pain? Or is it only different by circumstance? That which is food for the goose is food for the gander is not found to be more true than most hypotheses. Variation, which is sought to be eliminated, is found on close inspection and analysis to be the indispensable condition of the pleasures itself. We are, therefore, left inevitably to the present condition of necessary and complete ignorance in order to have any pleasure at all by our dealings with the world by means of our senses. It is argued that pleasure and pain might themselves be enriched, deepened and broadened by more experience, and that it is worth our while to help this process in a conscious manner. To this the answer would be that the better and more detailed realization of our utter ignorance, in the midst of the mockery of a civilization that is claimed to be based upon knowledge, would be a self-contradiction that is not likely to appeal to the asserting instinct of our rational nature and is calculated to make our condition no better than it is. Civilized wickedness and filth are not preferable to any nuisance of the uncivilized state. Satan, who may be allowed to possess the perfection of worldly culture, is probably more miserable than the uncivilized Gond. It would be difficult for the unbiased reason of man to choose between materialistic savagery and materialistic civilization. Ignorance is misery, says one of the wisest of proverbs. Increase of ignorance is not any decrease of misery. Ignorance is supposed to be the state of all empiric knowledge which is improperly assumed to be alone available to man. Our very nature is sometimes supposed to be incapable of real enlightenment. This axiom of pessimism is exploited for advising man to turn a deaf ear to the teacher of the Absolute. It is even more disastrously utilized for condemning the devotees themselves. It cannot be otherwise. The soul is in this case identified with the mind commodity. Abandonment of the mind, therefore, appears as equivalent to the abandonment of the soul, or to self-immolation. The mind seems to be our all. Groping in perpetual ignorance appears as our inevitable function, miscalled search for the truth. Empiric enthusiasts imaginatively describe this process as the eternal quest. These metaphors and denunciations do not, however, help us in any way. But, on the contrary, they only tend to obstruct the process of the real quest. Gopal Chakravarti is a typical Brahmana of the pseudo-Vedantic school of Sankara. He has no doubts regarding the goal of the Vedanta. According to him, the attainment of the knowledge of the Brahman, who possesses no distinctive function at all that is capable of being defined, is the goal. By the attainment of the knowledge of the real nature of the Brahman, the individual soul is freed from all the miseries of his apparent existence, which only seems to be limited and is, therefore, only supposed to be miserable, as there is only one entity, viz., the Brahman, who is ever free from all defect and all merits. The goal can be no other than complete absorption into the One. On the attainment of this desirable goal, there is no difference between the devotee devotion and the object of devotion. The service of the Brahman is thus only a temporary means to a final end, which means being different from the end and is, therefore, necessarily terminable with the attainment of the goal. It is the highest form of religion to try to realize, by the appropriate methods, the knowledge of and absorption into the undifferentiated Brahman. When the individual soul becomes one with the Brahman, the state of separate existence and necessity for any kind of distinguishable function terminate together. According to Gopal Chakravarti and his associates, this knowledge of the Brahman is higher than service and the termination of both. Knowledge and service is the highest goal. Gopal is quite sure that this is the only teaching of the scriptures. It may be observed at this place that Sankara does not discard the principle of worship, but declares its tentative necessity, which is terminable on self-realization, which, according to him, is identical with complete absorption into the One. Thakur Haridas distinguishes between devotion, work and knowledge. The soul in the bound state desires one of two alternative functions. If he is optimistic, he wants greater scope for enjoyment. If he happens to be pessimistic, he hankers for emancipation from the misery of mundane existence. The latter, viz., the pessimist, sometimes thinks that real emancipation is impossible so long as the consciousness of one's being different or separate from the One persists. It is to this extreme school of atheistic Vedantists, advocating unification with the Brahman, that Gopal Chakravarti, like most cultured people of his day as well as of this, happened to belong by his empiric predisposition. According to this school, fruitive work leads to empiric knowledge, and the latter to the third position of inexpressible oneness with the Brahman. Devotion or service is classed under fruitive work, which is assigned a lower position than empiric knowledge. The process of advance to the goal of complete unification with the One, according to this school, is devotion, blind faith rendering possible utilitarian work of a low order, bhakti, leading to work of a higher order, karma, which, in its turn, leads up to empiric knowledge of the uselessness of all knowledge and all activity, terminating in perfect absorption into the One, Brahmlaya. Haridas is neither a pessimist nor an optimist. He is an absolutist. He is convinced that the theory of complete absorption into the One is logically unsound and opposed to the real teaching of the scriptures. The alternatives of enjoyment and abstention from enjoyment exhaust indeed the possibilities of function of the mind and body, but they have no application to the soul, which is located beyond the reach of body and mind. The soul is substantially different from the mind and body. The soul is the substantive reality, while the mind is only his perverted reflection in the mirror of limited existence. The mind is the material shadow, so to say, of the soul, who is the spiritual substance. The mind is a material phenomenon galvanized into the appearance of self-consciousness by the impulse communicated to it by the deluded soul. Mind is the shadow of the perverse soul mirrored in matter. This description is, and can be, but an imperfect and misleading analogy of the relationship that actually subsists between mind and soul. The shadow of the material substance is not categorically different from the substance itself, both of them being material phenomena. The shadow of the soul in this case is, however, categorically different from the soul, being a material phenomenon pure and simple. The soul in his spiritual or natural conditional is categorically different from material phenomenon. The soul is self-consciousness itself. There can be no such thing as ignorance in the soul. There can be no such thing as genuine self-consciousness in the mind, which is non-soul. The apparent self-consciousness of the mind is really a state of complete ignorance, which is given its shape and color by the qualities of matter, viz., grossness, limitation, perishability, changeableness, etc. These unwholesome traits are non-existent and impossible in the soul. The soul is capable of forgetting his real nature, mistaking himself to be a material entity. The soul is not above one possible weakness, viz., willful rebellion against the truth. It is a real blunder on the part of the soul to choose to be a rebel, but the soul is perfectly free to refuse to serve the truth, i.e., Godhead. He thereby proves deliberately false to his own substantive nature, because it is the constituent function of the soul, in his natural state of perfect spiritual existence, to be the exclusive servant of the truth. The soul who rebels against Godhead is punished by his exile to the phenomenal world and by incarceration in the double material case of mind and body. The point will be further elucidated later. Fruitive work and empiric knowledge are functions of the mind and, therefore, purely material phenomena. By means of such work and knowledge the deluded soul cannot realize his natural function for the plain reason that they are not his proper function at all. By means of work and knowledge the soul only moves in a vicious circle of material existence which is seemingly conscious but really one of absolute ignorance. This is the explanation why by means of the undifferentiated knowledge of the Brahman freedom from the fetters of work and knowledge of this anomalous existence can be attained by crores of years of endeavor. This is what Gopal says. The delay is, however, not due to the complexity of the process as he supposes it to be. So long as a person continues to suppose that an impersonal all-pervasive entity is the goal of knowledge, one is not yet freed from the real ignorance of his spiritual function. This must be so because truth is not impersonal. Neither is truth a person in the sense in which the mentalists, including Sankara, apparently want us to understand the term. Spiritual personality is categorically different from the distorted empiric notion of the same. Until the nature of the personality of the truth is properly grasped, one continues in the deluded state, which is also the state of limitation, bondage. Therefore Gopal Chakravarti is right, although he is unaware of it, in holding that the chance of emancipation of a person who has attained to the notion of Godhead as an impersonal and inactive, although all-pervasive and transcendental, entity, is very slight. Gopal does not understand that his ideal person is also necessarily no less deluded than himself if he supposes his condition to be the goal. The interpretation of the text relied upon by Gopal Chakravarti, said Thakur Haridas, is that of a person who does not understand the nature of the name by reason of his having no access to him. The deluded person is no longer consciously contradicting himself and is not, therefore, insincere in the sense of being double-tongued. He is certainly to be pitied. Neither can his conduct be regarded as sincere inasmuch as it is opposed to his real nature, of which he only happens to be ignorant by his own conscious perversity. The empiric casuist who affects to believe in the impersonal nature of the truth is only pushing his conscious perversity of the choice of untruth to its logical conclusion. If the deliberate error is not ignored, his conduct cannot be regarded as consistent, being altogether untrue. Gopal Chakravarti's source of error lay deeper than the plane on which he stood and was, therefore, naturally incomprehensible to him in his condition of cultured perversity. The Vaishnavas, who alone understand the real cause of the worldly ailment, alone possess the true spirit of toleration. Thakur Haridas showed his toleration of the Rankathism of deluded Gopal Chakravarti by abstaining from disturbing him further. This toleration really means the withdrawal of his causeless, apparently aggressive mercy from a deluded soul whose opposition to Godhead is likely to be increased by the process. It is the greatest possible misfortune that can befall a conditioned soul to miss the special mercy of the Vaishnava by his successful opposition to the truth. The apparent intolerance of a Vaishnava is as helpful to a person as his tolerance of evil. The Vaishnava never cooperates with the offending soul in his sinful activities. He does not agree to be false to himself and his eternal master to please the confirmed apostate. Such sympathetic toleration of evil is a grave offense against the truth, notwithstanding the significant fact that it alone is relished by the pantheistic school of the pseudo-Vedantists. The point reached marks almost the limit of rational discussion towards the spiritual issue that is open to the empiricist. He cannot proceed further without discarding the method of empiricism by giving up completely the process of his unaided effort. It was not possible for Gopal Chakravarti to retrace his steps by any other method. That he was not at all prepared for this is proved by his offensive conduct towards Thakur Haridas, who had, therefore, no other alternative but to leave him to the mercies of Maya. But the actual goodwill of Haridas towards the offender bore its fruit in the swift punishment that could be intelligible to the sufferer himself, that smote him in the form of leprosy. Gopal was, thereby, afforded an excellent opportunity of revising his impersonal doctrine. But he was of course free to avail of it or not. The godless attitude is an attitude of absolute confidence in one's own judgment and power. The atheist is not at all disposed to submit to another in any circumstances. He has to be compelled to submit to non-God because he can consistently submit only to compelling force. Such submission alone is appreciated in the state of sin and ignorance, which is a radically false position and necessarily entails constant irrational conduct on a really rational being unnaturally disposed to accept the same through the no less unnatural fear of punishment. The holy name of Godhead is not a thing of this world. The name of Godhead is identical with Godhead himself. The Godhead appears in this world in the form of the name on the lips of his pure devotees. He appears as the transcendental sound on the spiritual lips of the soul in the state of grace. The name of Godhead appearing on the lips of a pure devotee as the transcendental sound is perceptible as such only to the spiritual ear. These statements are likely to appear absurd and puerile to the dogmatic impersonalist. Can the soul, he will persist to ask, have lips and ears? Can the soul have senses? But can the empiricist know, even if he has? The transcendentalists maintain that the soul has an infinity of senses of which the physical senses are a perverted reflection. There cannot even be the shadow of existence of the physical senses if there were no substantive spiritual senses. But there are also the spiritual senses themselves as distinct from but not unrelated to their corresponding shadowy reflections in this phenomenal world. This is involved in the very definition of the absolute. The spiritual sense is categorically different from the physical sense. The spiritual senses are perfect and self-conscious, there being no interval one or barrier of time or space between the sense and its possessor. The spiritual body is indivisible and perfectly self-conscious in every part and is identical with the owner of the body. All this is incomprehensible to us, although it is perfectly consistency with the fundamental principles of indivisible substantive existence that are also acceptable to the empiricist. The empiricist, although he may sometimes under pressure of his own logic seem to agree with the conclusions of transcendentalism, finds it impossible to adopt them in practice. The absolute conduct is not possible on the mundane plane to which he finds himself strictly confined by his own postulates backed by the real deluding potency. If one is merely disposed to regard any sound as transcendental, such wish alone will not make the sound of his choice to become really transcendental. Similarly, if a person is disposed to regard a transcendental sound as an occurrence of the mundane atmosphere, such attitude will not also affect the subjective nature of the transcendental sound. There is real difference between the transcendental sound and mundane sound. The transcendental sound is identical with the object denoted by the sound. The mundane sound is separated from the object denoted by it by the intervals of time and space. To hear the mundane sound of the name of a lion is not the same thing as to see the beast. On the spiritual plane, the very word lion is identical with the animal. The animal is fully realizable by and in the hearing of his name, whereas the real nature of the mundane animal, denoted by the mundane sound, ever remains a thing unknown. The name of Krsna is identical with Godhead, but the name of Krsna does not manifest himself on mundane lips nor to the mundane ear. The name Krsna appears in his form of the transcendental sound on the spiritual lips of his devotees and is heard by the spiritual ear of the submissive soul by the grace of Krsna. The name Krsna is identical with the possessor of the name. The name Krsna appears to the listening ear, as he is, only by degrees. As soon as the dormant soul catches the first faint reflection of his light, he is at once completely free from the bondage of ignorance and sin. It is the name who comes of his own accord to our fettered soul. The bound jiva has no access to the presence of Krsna on his own initiative. Krishna's approach is heralded by the harbinger of light, whose first glimmerings on their appearance put an end to all misconception regarding the categorical difference between light and darkness. Unless and until the soul becomes aware of the true nature of spiritual existence by being so enlightened by the source of all consciousness, he is sure to mistake the mind for his real self and the mental function as the only knowledge. If at this stage he does not willfully shut his eyes but keeps them turned towards the growing light, he gradually and in due course obtains the sight of the concrete source of all light. This is the mode of appearance of the holy name. The sight of Krsna is alone capable of inspiring love for Krsna. This is the position of Thakur Haridas as explained by himself to the Pandits who were in assembly at the house of the Mazumdars. Thakur Haridas mercifully explains that the different concrete forms of the so-called liberation concocted by the mentalists as their unknowable summum bonum are the outcome of the desire for sensuous gratification. If one could live in the happy realms of Krsna described in the scriptures, the empiricist supposes that such a person should be enabled to enjoy more good things than are available on the earth if his condition is really worth having. The same desire for extended opportunities of sensuous enjoyment happens also to be the real motive behind the formulation of the other forms of the empiricist's saved existence. The grossness of the ideal of liberation is fully unmasked when one is told that the Salvationist's final form is to become the equal of Godhead by merging with the object of his worship. It is to this unnatural and profane position that the unchecked speculations of the mentalists are logically bound to lead in the long run. Thakur Haridas ascribes the grossness of the ideal to the attitude of the empiric thinker, viz., the insatiable desire for sensuous pleasure. The desire to enjoy is categorically different from, and wholly incompatible with, the desire to serve, to love. If one feels a real desire to serve Krishna, he would lose all taste for his own enjoyment. All impurity, unwholesomeness and misery are fortunately and mercifully ordained by the Lord as the inevitable consequence of the insatiable desire for selfish enjoyment. But the soul who turns away from immediate enjoyment by considerations of greater prospective enjoyment in the sequel cannot also for that very reason realize the condition of loving devotion to the feet of the Lord, however strongly impressed he may profess to be of the desirability of such a state. He is, no doubt, free to think that he really desires it. But at the same time he is wholly incapable of ever attaining to it by such desire. But, says Thakur Haridas, he may nevertheless attain to love for Krishna by the chanting of the holy name, by the grace of the holy name himself. This is the special dispensation for the age which is so irremediably speculative, and there is no other way open to the age of attaining to the loving service of Krishna. Haridas refers to the texts of the scriptures to prove the truth of his statements. This is the only proper use of the Shastras. The Shastras bear witness to the truth of the realizations of all really pure souls. There is one other fact which is worthy of our notice. The Pandits of the learned assembly, headed by Hiranya Mazumdar, the master of the house, took the side of Thakur Haridas. They not only strongly censured the conduct of Gopal Chakravarti in the open assembly, but Hiranya Mazumdar thought it his duty to renounce all further connection with a Brahmana who could be guilty of an act of discourtesy to the devotee of Godhead. Nevertheless, the Pandits and Mazumdar himself felt themselves involved in the sin of Gopal Chakravarti by the unhappy circumstance of their having had to hear most reluctantly the blasphemous words uttered by Gopal in their presence. For this sin the only expiation, prescribed by the Shastras, was to seek in all humility the pardon of Thakur Haridas, not for the offender but for themselves. This is not mere courtesy but an unavoidable necessity if one really wants to serve the truth. Any association, deliberate or accidental, with untruth tends to obscure our vision of the truth, who is, indeed, a very jealous master. Those who are disposed to serve the truth with causeless, loving devotion, throw to the winds all considerations of ignorant propriety or ignorant justice and are never satisfied by serving the truth by all their senses at all time and in all circumstances. By the grace of Thakur Haridas, this instinct of loving devotion actually manifested itself in the conduct of those who had listened with faith to the absolute truth from his pure lips. Sri Raghunath Das Goswami was a child at this time. He used to visit the Thakur in his hut during his stay at Chandpur. The boy was the fortunate recipient of the mercy of Thakur Haridas. This is considered by Sri Krishnadas Kavira Goswami as the real cause of Raghunath Das's subsequent unique devotion to the feet of Sri Chaitanya. The mercy of a sadhu acts equally on all persons, irrespective of age, sex or condition, all of whom have an equal chance of being benefited by associating with a real sadhu. The interests of the soul are not capable of being adversely affected by any worldly conditions. The boy's soul has no defect of immaturity any more than that of an old man the advantage of maturity. Such maturity or immaturity has no relevancy in one's associating with a sadhu. The boy's soul, eventually with the soul of the old man, may or may not be disposed to listen to the words of a sadhu for the genuine purpose of acting up to the same. It is as necessary for a child to associate with a sadhu acts for an adult. But in neither case one can be sure of obtaining the mercy of the sadhu with whom he may choose to associate. The sadhu is kind to one who is really inclined to serve Godhead. It is the function of a sadhu to foster one's inclination for the service of the Lord by means of his conduct and words. The articulated sound is, however, the sadhu's unambiguous weapon to fight all ungodliness. It should puzzle the muddled brain of the whole race of self-conceited empiricists to understand why and how the sadhu need have no other work except talking about almost anything to whom he likes. Any person who is spoken to by a sadhu even for the tiny space of a second has every chance of attaining the real object of life, which is unattainable by infinite endeavor by any other method. Nay, it is our duty to listen to a real sadhu, if we are fortunate enough to meet him, in preference to all other duties which are not only of secondary importance but a positive obstruction on the path of the highest and only good. Chapter XX, Thakur Haridas before his meeting with Sri Gaur-Sundar, Kant. From Chandpur, Thakur Haridas came to the village of Fulia on the Ganges near Santipur, the home of Sri Advaita Akriya. Haridas was thereby enabled to associate with Akriya Gosain, who roared with delight on gaining the company of Haridas. Haridas, remarks Thakur Brindavandas, floated on the ocean of the mellow quality, rasa, of Govinda, cowherd Krishna, by obtaining the society of Advaita. The last sentence mentions an important truth. The philanthropic sensualists, Prakrita Sahajiyas, affect to believe that Thakur Haridas had no access to the amorous pastimes of Sri Krishna, being exclusively devoted to the chanting of the name. This shows ignorance of the real nature of the holy name as well as of the transcendental amor. It is repeatedly declared by the Shastras that the name of Krishna is identical with his form, quality, activity and servitorship. The Bhagavatam, 11-40, bears out the statement of Sri Rupa, B.H. R. Sindhu P.L. 311 that liking for the chanting of the name is the conclusive sign of the first appearance of spiritual amor. Those who are addicted to sensuous pleasures have no liking for the name of Godhead. Those pseudo-ascetics, who do not chant the name of Krishna, are really indifferent to the service of Godhead. Thakur Haridas could possess such an overpowering inclination for chanting the name of Krishna by reason of his real love for the Lord and consequent real detachment from the pleasures of the world. Thakur Haridas, who was acquainted with the mellow quality of the name of Krishna, is the greatest of teachers as he is alone authorized to admit one to the meaning of the Shastras treating of spiritual amor. The mellow quality of amorous love for Krishna is realized as the effect of the chanting of the name of Krishna by the method that is free from offense against the name. The philanthropists are effectively shut out from all access to the experience of the real nature of the spiritual quality of amorous love by their offensive taking of the name of Krishna. By reason of their excessive addiction to sensuous enjoyment, which is aggravated by chanting the name without trying simultaneously to avoid committing such offense, the philanthropists fall into the most heinous blunder of supposing that the spiritual amor is identical with gross sensuality. The only way of getting rid of the lust of the flesh is by chanting the name of Krishna by avoiding the 10 offenses against the name. These particulars should enable the unbiased reader to realize the nature as well as the cause of the misunderstanding that is commonly entertained by both liberationists and elevationists in regard to the efficacy of the chanting of the holy name. Those who believe in the superiority of fruitive work and empiric knowledge, or, in other words, the average men of the world, find it impossible to sympathize with those philanthropists who teach by their preaching and practice that the taking of the name Krishna, without really